Chapter 356. When the soldiers saw the young man trying to stand up, they quickly went up and held him down. They looked at their lord with inquiring eyes and asked, "My lord, should we take this guy down?" Brando looked at the young man. He knew that this was the second son of Sermenta, but he found it interesting that the old-fashioned gentleman should have such an interesting son. He had already changed his mind and shook his head. "Let him go. Let him go?" The soldiers were stunned and looked at each other in confusion. "Let him go," Brando repeated. The soldiers loosened the thick hemp rope around Cargly's wrists. The young man frowned and rubbed his wrists. Even though the soldiers did not beat him up, they were not polite to him either. He looked at the red marks on his snow-white wrist and couldn't help but frown. However, the young man was more concerned about Brando's intentions. He raised his head and stared at Brendel with his light gray eyes for a while before asking, "Are you really from this place? Are you trying to say that you're the leader of the mob?" "I wouldn't dare." The young man smiled awkwardly. In fact, Carglass was surprised when he realized that the other party was a young man about the same age as him. Not only did he surpass him in swordsmanship, but he was also the leader of the mob. The more he looked at Brando, the more he felt that he had lived in vain for the past 10 years. It was just like what Lord Paulus had told him, staying in a small place like Tonajul would only limit his strength. "But I'm curious," Carglass rubbed his wrists and asked, "why did you let me go? If I told you that I wanted you to work for me, would you believe me?" Brando asked. "No." The young man shook his head. "Why should I work for you? Then what if I told you that I'm Griffin Corvado? I'm a secret envoy sent by Princess Oderfeist to establish a secret base here to keep Count Randner in check. Would you believe me?" Not only Carglass, but even Coden stared at Brando with his mouth agape. The young man did not seem to believe him at all. He looked at Brando as if he was looking at a lunatic, but the old man seemed to have woken up. He thought about the relationship between Brando and the royal family of Corvado and what Brando had done in the past few days. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that the young man's words might not be so unreliable. At least some of them weren't lying. "This joke isn't funny at all," Carglass frowned, "but since you're the lord of this place, I'll say it's okay." Brando smiled and took out a silver brooch. This brooch is called the Silver Coat of Arms. It's the token of the Wang family's knight order. The young man was stunned. "How do I know if you're lying to me?" Coden was also skeptical. He had heard of the Silver Coat of Arms before, but he didn't know if the one in Brando's hand was real. The more suspicious the old man was, the more he felt that Brando was telling the truth. Otherwise, how could it be so coincidental that these well-trained rioters managed to kill Groton? Brando put away the brooch. In fact, the brooch was real. It was sent along with a private letter from Groton. The letter was simple. It mainly told him that the royal family appreciated young men like him and did not mention anything else. This was just a routine reply, and the whole letter was watertight. Even if Brendel had this so-called Princess Griffin's handwritten letter, it would be useless. However, the young lord still treated the letter like a treasure and carefully kept it. Amandina could not understand his actions and complained about the stinginess of the royal family of Covardo. Only an idiot like him would not be able to see through it. But how could Brando not see it? The regent princess used to be the dream lover of many otakus. As they grew older, most of them eventually realized that their love was just a youthful longing, but they could not let go of the most sincere memories in their hearts. Especially when the letter from the princess who had passed away was placed on his desk once again. It would be a lie to say that he wasn't excited. "All right, let's not talk about it," Brando continued. "I heard that you were planning to bring a few servants to the north to answer Groton's call to revive the Corvado dynasty?" Carglass stopped what he was doing. "Seems like you know quite a lot. You're more outstanding than most of the people I've met." "Tonajul can't restrict your movements," Brando said as he tried to recall Carglass's experiences in the past. Unfortunately, he did not manage to find anything. This was not surprising. There were many young people like him in Erewhon, but not all of them were able to shine in the end. As the waves washed away the sand, those who were not strong enough naturally hid away. However, there were more who were not lucky enough. Many of them died on the way to Vlada. Bandits, monsters, cultists, and lords with ill intentions. The countryside of Erewhon was not safe in this era. "You sound like you're mocking me." Carglass frowned. "No," Brando shook his head. "I'm serious. So, are you willing?" "What do you mean?" Carglass was stunned. "I'm lacking an adjutant." "Are you kidding?" Carglass's eyes widened. Brando shook his head. "I said that I'm serious. I think you're capable enough for this position. Most importantly, you have the willingness, Wait, Carglass interrupted, I never said yes. Then are you willing to stay in Tonajul for the rest of your life? Are you willing to miss this era? Are you willing to become a lord in the countryside and an old man in the end? Why does it sound like you're cursing my father? Carglass frowned. He did not act like a captive, but more like a guest of Brando's. But why should I believe you? I'll give you a chance to try. But once you've boarded a pirate ship, it won't be so easy to get off. I understand, the young man said warily. If you want to persuade me, you have to let me see some benefits. If I fall for your trick without risking anything, won't I seem a little too incompetent? When the young man said this, he was already moved. He was born to be a restless person. Whether it was relying on the princess or following this young man, he only hoped that he would not be like his father and live an ordinary life. The boldness in Brando's words made him feel that this young man might be able to fulfill his dream. He thought for a moment and asked tentatively, "Who are you and what do you want to do?" The courtyard fell into a dead silence. Even Coden felt that this question was a little abrupt. But Brando replied, "I've already told you who I am." As for what I want to do, Carglass smiled. His smile was a little meaningful under the rare sunshine of the winter afternoon. If I say that I want to grab Duke Arek's beard and give him a good beating, then go to Madara to settle my debt, would you believe me? Carglass was stunned for a moment, then the young man's eyes lit up. He nodded fiercely, "Good idea." Coden looked at the two lunatics and finally felt that he was getting old. Back when he was with Tobbs, he was also fearless. Their regiment was like the demons of the November War, causing all the enemies on the battlefield to tremble in fear. However, the times were different and the present was different from the past. The old swordsman looked at the youth's eager face and hurriedly dragged him to the side. He whispered to him, "Are you crazy, Brendel? He's Lord Maxon's son. If you kidnap him, that stubborn old man will fight you to the death. You better think twice." "Fight me to the death?" Brando was both angry and amused. "Wait until he gets out of my dungeon first." "You're not going to let him out?" Coden suddenly felt that this young man was a little too much. On the one hand, he had kidnapped the son of a noble who had painstakingly raised for more than 10 years, and on the other hand he was going to lock him up in the dungeon. "Why don't you ask him if he's going to let Lord Maxon out?" Brando pointed at Carglass. Coden looked back at Carglass and shook his head. If Lord Maxon knew that his son had been betrayed, he would probably beat him to death. If Brendel told him to slow down this matter, he would definitely raise both hands in agreement. Young people these days. Coden looked at Brando helplessly. "All right, don't worry. I'll take good care of Lord Maxon. I have high hopes for Carglass. He'll definitely have great achievements in the future." Coden shook his head. "Brando, is what you said before true?" "What?" "Don't play dumb," Coden said fiercely. "I'm talking about the princess." "It's fake." Scram. Coden kicked at Brando, but he was already prepared and dodged. He smiled and shook his head. "Master Coden, even if it's true, it's still a secret." "How could I say it so casually?" Coden was stunned, but he quickly thought that it was possible. But this young man had done too many things that were both true and false. Coden could not completely trust him and could only suppress his suspicions. Brendel looked at the old swordsman and interrupted his thoughts. "Old man, are you interested in going on a trip? Traveling?" Coden was stunned and looked at the young man strangely. What was he up to this time? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 357. While Coden was puzzled by Brando's strange suggestion, Amandina and Scarlet had arrived at an abandoned manor near Abes. The two ladies' carriage entered the depths of the manor and were received by a few mercenaries who had been waiting for them. The moment they got off the carriage, they saw a group of rowdy youths not far away. The manor had been renovated nearly a month ago. The abandoned broken walls were refurbished with wooden walls. Now, the size of the manor was much larger than before. Red pines were planted on the periphery, and in the coming year, it would grow into a lush green area, enough to cover all the scenery in the manor. There were hidden sentries in the pines, and they could support each other on the wooden walls. The defense here was tight, and it was Brando's secret camp. It was also the training camp for the future White Lion infantry. The manor was divided into two parts. The southeast quarter was provided to Brando's mercenaries and adventurers as dormitories. These people would protect the manor and maintain order before the first batch of White Lion infantry matured. In the future, Brando would either merge them into the new army or transfer them to other places. However, this depended on how loyal Cornelius was to the group. The person in charge of this place was the handsome middle-aged mercenary leader with silver hair. Cornelius was originally suspicious of Brando's decision to transfer him out of AB's, but after understanding the importance of this place to Brando's group, he quickly realized that it was not a matter of estrangement, but of an important position. The regiment commander immediately became proactive and organized the camp's affairs in an orderly manner. Brando was a good judge of character. Cornelius was mediocre when it came to commanding, but this meticulous man had an unparalleled talent when it came to logistics. This could be seen from the current order of the camp. Everything was in order, and the sentinels in charge of guarding the camp did not have any bad habits left over from the past, although they were either mercenaries or adventurers a month ago. Of course, there were unavoidable exceptions. Amandina got off the carriage and stood under the shade of a mangrove tree. Scarlet, who was responsible for her safety, stood silently by the side. The tree beside them was a common evergreen tree in Tanajal. This evergreen tree would dye the area dark green even in winter. Amandina stood under the shade of the tree and looked at the noisy scene not far away. There were about 60 youths there. The mercenaries were maintaining order in the field, but most of the youths were picked from the locals and had not seen much of the world. When they saw a carriage stop under the shade of the tree, and a noble lady came down from it, they immediately became restless. "Look, there's a noble lady over there. Why would a noble lady show her face in this place? Is she the Lord's daughter? My lord is young, I've seen him before. Then she must be his fiancée. That's possible." Amandina couldn't help but overhear the whispers. She listened quietly, then turned to look at Scarlet. "What's wrong?" The girl swayed her red ponytail and looked back at Amandina with a slightly startled expression. "Nothing." Amandina replied and turned back to look at the youths. She looked at the youths. This was one of the Lord's plans. The formation of the White Lion Legion was on Tanajal's agenda from the beginning, but building a powerful legion was not done overnight. Brando planned to train a group of youths to be the backbone of the White Lion Legion in the future. They would be officers but also his personal night guards. Most of these youths came from the nearby areas. They were the sons of farmers, craftsmen, or small merchants. Some came from the manors, the descendants of nobles, mercenaries, and adventurers. But they had one thing in common. They were all less than 20 years old and some were even teenagers. They were like a piece of white paper full of plasticity. They stood there, whispering and discussing with each other. They were uneasy and curious about the future. They had only been here for 3 or 4 days and had only undergone simple training. Perhaps they had already been whipped by the mercenaries to remind them of the importance of discipline, but it was inevitable that they had a youthful immaturity and restlessness. Only a few young men who came from mercenaries or aristocratic families were slightly more composed. They stood out from the rest of the crowd and easily attracted the attention of the young ladies of the noble families. "Who are these people?" she asked. "They are the children of the nearby manors." The mercenary next to her replied. "Children of the manors?" Amandina was puzzled. The children of the manors were the descendants of nobles, so why would they come here? They snuck out. So they are the children of nobles who are looking for excitement. Amandina looked at the youths. "Have you investigated them?" Her words were unnecessary. Since they were here, they had no choice but to be sent to the Black Forest. No matter what kind of mentality they had, they would be sent to the Black Forest. Amandina could only hope that these youths would not regret their choice. She took out the pocket watch from her bosom. This pocket watch was given to her by Brendel. Even though it was just a cheap silver-plated pocket watch, she had always used it carefully and treated it like a treasure. She did not plan to change it again. She opened the watch and saw that it was almost 11 o'clock in the morning. She looked up and saw a mercenary running towards her from the field. The mercenary stopped in front of her and saluted her with one hand on his chest. "It's almost time, miss," he replied. Amandina nodded. The mercenary bowed to her again and ran back. Amandina took a deep breath and blinked her eyes. She saw 4 large carts coming in from the other side of the clearing. Of course, these carriages were different from the 4-wheeled carriages used by the nobles. Compared to those exquisite handicraft-like things, these carriages were more like large, inferior products. Originally, these caravans were used by merchants and farmers to transport goods. However, the mercenaries did not care about their use. They numbered the youths and gave them a number plate. The number plates were made by Brando based on the Shaflun silver mine. They were also made of wood, but under the rough workmanship were Tamar's magic imprints. They could be identified through a red crystal that was imprinted with detection magic. These crystals were in the hands of the people in charge of this project, but other than Brando's crystal that was permanent, the others had to be replaced regularly. After the youths got on the carts, the clearing became quiet. It was as if the discussions before were just an illusion. Amandina let out a sigh of relief. She watched the last person get on the carts and turned to Scarlet. "Let's get on as well." "Aren't we going with them?" Scarlet asked. "We're going to the other side." Amandina turned around and walked towards the carts. "Our lord's whereabouts are a secret. We can't let others see our carts." The red-haired girl nodded. She took a closer look at Amandina and felt a little admiration for her meticulousness. "Do you want to go?" She followed Amandina and asked behind her back. "What is it?" "The dark forest." Amandina stopped, but this time she did not answer. At the border of the dark forest, Brando walked down from the carts and felt the lazy afternoon sun. He could not help but stretch his body. He raised his head and watched as the rays of the sun shone through the rows of black pine trees, forming a dazzling halo. The sparse sunlight in the forest fell on the grass. Then he heard a grumble behind him. "I knew you were up to no good." Brando turned around and saw Coden jump down from the carts with a gloomy expression. Ever since the old man left Schaflund, he was dressed in military attire. He had a long sword, a dagger, a short bow, and a quiver of arrows. He looked more like an adventurer than a traveler. He took a deep breath. Even though the dark forest was filled with danger, the air was refreshing. Even though the air was cold and damp, it had the freshness of the vegetation. Coden lowered his head and saw that his boots had landed on a thick layer of grass. He stomped his feet, causing the pests to scatter in all directions. "Centipedes, scorpions?" Coden shook his head. "This place is really cursed. I heard that you fought outside the borders of civilization during the November War." Brando turned around and asked. "Don't even talk about that." Coden did not want to think about it. The November War was so fierce that they had to retreat into the dark forest to fight. It was also the only time after the New Age that the commanders had to recklessly devise a strategy. Both sides of the war were in a frenzy, like two dying beasts clawing at each other's throats, but no one could kill the other first. The brutality of the war was beyond the imagination of the later generations. In a battle, there were often only a few dozen people left in the organized army. Sometimes only a few people survived. Mountains of corpses and seas of blood could be seen on the battlefield. It was common for dozens of miles of land to be covered with corpses. It was a hellish scene in most cold weapons battles. Brando understood and did not mention it again. Carglass, however, was the third to jump out of the carriage. The young man was the last to alight. He grabbed Mordenkainen off the coachman's seat and dragged the poor elementalist a short distance into the forest. "Let me go." The man who had the duck as his familiar protested loudly. However, in terms of strength he was no match for a swordsman of a higher rank. Carglass ignored the man and looked around. He took a deep breath and asked, "Is this the dark forest?" "What? You're not satisfied?" Coden turned around. It looked similar to the forest in Harrigal Mountain. Carglass stared curiously into the depths of the forest. It was as dark as an oil painting. "I hope you don't regret it." "Regret?" Carglass shook his head and grinned. "I did at first, but now I don't regret it at all. Why didn't I think of going into the dark forest for an adventure?" "That's because you were just a little lunatic. You haven't met a big lunatic yet." Coden looked at Brando and complained in his mind. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 358. That's because you're just a little lunatic. You haven't met a big lunatic yet. Coden glanced at Brando and cursed in his mind. But the old swordsman still turned to look at Brendel and asked, "All right, where are the boys that you mentioned that need to be taken care of?" Brando smiled. The reason why he asked Coden to come out was simple. He wanted to use this opportunity to train the young lads. The Black Forest was full of dangers and it was the best place to train them. With the young lads by his side, it would be beneficial for him to pass on his ideas to them. But the problem was that the dangers in the Black Forest were unpredictable. It was not easy to protect the young lads that he had painstakingly trained. Brando could not do it alone. He needed manpower. The Shire, Medisha, and Scarlet were all gold-ranked warriors. The 12 mercenaries of Lopez were also at the peak of silver-ranked, but Brando knew that he could not bring anyone else with him. The current situation in the ABs did not allow him to mobilize too much of his forces. If not for the fact that Scarlet could not be too far away from him for too long, he would not even want to bring the red-haired girl with him. Because of this, he had to use the excuse of traveling to bring Coden here. His goal was to get the old swordsman to help him. He believed that even though Coden said that he was cautious, he would still help him when the time came. As expected, Coden only hesitated for a moment before agreeing to his conditions. As long as he did not directly oppose Count Randner or become his subordinate, he did not mind coming out to relax. Of course, even so, he would not treat Brando well. "We're almost there," Brando replied. He looked into the distance and saw a black dot appearing in the wilderness outside the forest. The black dot quickly grew bigger and turned into a caravan. 4 large caravans slowly drove into the forest and stopped one by one. The mercenaries in the caravan recognized their lord. They immediately got off the caravan and bowed to Brando. "My lord." "Is everyone here?" Brando asked. "Yes, my lord." "Where's Scarlet?" "Miss Scarlet is also here. She's with Miss Amandina." The mercenary replied with his head bowed respectfully. Brando raised his head and looked at the last caravan. The door opened and Amandina and Scarlet alighted. But he was surprised to see the wild elf sisters in the caravan as well. They were the last to alight, and the younger sister of the sisters waved her hand when she saw Brando. "My lord." Because the mercenaries of Lopez had been carrying out heavy missions for a long time, this little girl called Tia had not seen Brendel for a long time. She looked especially excited at this time. "Why are they here?" Brendel nodded to the wild elf girl and looked at Amandina inquisitively. Amandina, she looked at the 4 caravans in the caravan as if anything she would tess. She raised her head and looked at Brando. "Miss Falerne is here to take care of my lord's daily needs. So she's really going to be my personal maid." Brando almost coughed. He looked at Amandina in surprise. "I don't need a maid." The wild elf's face darkened. She stood behind Amandina and glared at Brando with her emerald green eyes. Her eyes were saying, "Behave yourself, my lord." Brendel was at a loss for words. He did not think about being a maid at all. It was purely because Falerne's job overlapped too much with that job. He thought for a while and changed his words. "What I mean is, I don't need to be taken care of. I'm not one of those people who would open their mouths and stretch out their hands for clothes. But you're the Lord of Tanajal," Amandina said seriously. "That's just a title, Amandina. Isn't it the same in the past?" "The past is the past." Amandina looked at him and said with a hint of reprimand, "You're the Lord of Tanajal now. How can you not have a maid?" She glanced at Brando from the corner of her eyes. "You wouldn't want the Lord of the Shire to take care of your daily needs, would you, my lord?" Brando finally choked on his words. He shuddered at the thought of that scene. He looked at Falerne. In fact, Amandina had been instructing Falerne to do this kind of work for him. He was used to it even if he was not used to it. In the end, he raised his hands in surrender. "This girl is not bad," Coden said to Brando as he looked at Amandina from the side. "She's a noble's daughter and she's beautiful. Your grandfather will be satisfied with her." "What do you mean?" Brando glanced at the old man who wanted to stir up trouble. "What?" Coden seemed to have realized something and said with a smile, "You're not satisfied? Then I'll introduce her to Carglass. After all, he's going to be your assistant in the future, and he's going to have the same rotten taste as you." Brando coughed and looked at Amandina. "Stop talking nonsense," he replied. "Lecherous thoughts but no guts. You're not as good as your grandfather in this regard, little guy." This time Coden wasn't angry at all. The old man patted him on the shoulder and walked away with a victorious look on his face. He was in a good mood. It was rare for him to catch Brando's sore spot. Brendel turned back to look at Amandina, and her face flushed red. She lowered her head and whispered, "Prepare yourself, my lord. Time is limited." "You're going back alone?" After Coden's reminder for the first time, Brendel felt that this noble lady who always went against him was actually a little cute. Amandina nodded her head. "It's too dangerous." Brando shook his head. "'Cause she wants to go with my lord." Amandina originally thought that it would be better if fewer people knew about Brando entering the Dark Forest. Moreover, the journey from the border of the Dark Forest to Abes was not long, and the territory of Abes was under the control of the mercenaries. She did not think that there would be any problems. "I mean, you should come with us," Brando replied. "Ah." Amandina let out a low cry. Because of her own abilities, Brando almost never brought her along when he went out. Amandina felt a little regretful about this, but she knew where her abilities were and did not think too much about it. However, Brando's sudden request was far beyond her expectations. She knew what kind of place the Dark Forest was, and she would only be a burden if she went. I don't think it's a good idea." Amandina wanted to refuse, but there was a small voice in her heart that told her to agree. The thought of being able to travel and adventure with this young lord made her a little hesitant. It was as if she had returned to the days before. Amandina, who had always been calm and rational, was a little hesitant. But Brando did not come up with this idea on the spur of the moment. He had Kashi bring Amandina over for a reason. He would have many things to do in the future and he could not stay in the territory all the time. Amandina would be his first assistant in the future, and she would be the first to take over Valhalla. It was important to maintain the territory's normal operations, so he had to let her familiarize herself with the territory. Valhalla was different from ordinary territories. Once it awakened, the shock it would bring to mortals would be enormous. In order to accept this shock in the shortest amount of time, the fastest way was to have someone personally activate it and experience the awakening process together with it. It's fine, this is actually part of the plan. Brando replied, but this plan is not irreplaceable. The dark forest is very dangerous, so I'll leave the choice to you. What about the Roman lady? Amandina frowned and hesitated. If I'm not here, no one will be able to watch over her. Don't worry. Brando did not expect her to be worried about this, but he shook his head. She won't do anything rash. Amandina was surprised. She had been in the Abyss for several months, and there was not a day when the merchant lady did not encounter some small trouble. The Roman's muddle-headedness made her wonder how the merchant lady survived for more than 10 years. Because of this, she had even revered Roman's aunt for a time, wondering what kind of outstanding woman could have taught this guy to be so obedient. But Brando knew that in his absence, the little fellow would be more obedient than anyone else. Because only he could see clearly that little Roman's actions were nothing more than to attract his attention, just like the little tricks animals used to attract their mates. Even though the merchant lady was muddle-headed, she was naturally clever, and it was because of this that Brando found her cute. So what? He asked. Amandina paused for a moment and seemed to understand this point. She thought for a moment and blurted out, "Of course I'm willing." Amandina immediately coughed lightly. "I mean, I'm not afraid of danger if I work for my lord." Brando smiled faintly. "Thank you." He immediately pointed at Tia, who was curiously looking at the grass and trees in the forest. "Then what's the situation with this young lady?" He thought that it was understandable for a sister to come and take care of his daily life. Moreover, he might be able to obtain unexpected rewards if he brought along a lucky girl. But what's with this little sister? Could it be that Amandina knows the legendary buy one get one free? Buy a maid and get a loli for free. If that's the case, this business can be done. She came at Master Tamar's request. Amandina answered. Brando finally remembered that this little loli was Master Tamar's assistant. But why did Tamar ask her to come? Wait, he suddenly thought of a question. She's here to collect materials? Amandina nodded her head. P.S. It's a little late, sorry. Also, in the future, I won't change the number of chapters for the first, second, and third chapters of the same title. Chapter 359. Brando understood Tamar's thoughts. The dark forest was a barren land that had never been reclaimed. Humans rarely set foot in this place. The laws that were affected by chaos would be reset every once in a while. The forest was grotesque and variegated. Buried beneath the surface of the ground were treasures that humans could never imagine. Due to the influence of the moon of Mana, not only were there all kinds of monsters in the forest, even the magical plants were full of vitality. There were even places where magic gathered to form large open mines of magic crystals. Gems flowed in streams and gold coins gushed out from fountains. These were not just descriptions and poems, but they could also become reality here. The dark forest was not only a forbidden area for civilization, but also an unknown treasure trove in the eyes of humans. However, after the Second Holy War, many races on the continent had lost their strength due to internal strife. The glorious scene of night entering the dark forest could not be seen again. However, the bizarre legends of history had survived. Legend had it that the forest was rich in rare materials. The river flowing with moonlight could bring the dead back to life. The red veins beneath the earth hid the blood of sages that could turn steel into gold. The dragon's graveyard had dragon bones that were more precious than diamonds. There were also leaves that could create an illusion of paradise if they were burned. These were the greatest treasures in the eyes of alchemists. As long as they could obtain one of these materials, they could create a legendary item that would leave their name in history. Every alchemist yearned for the dark forest, but most who dared to enter the dark forest died in the stomachs of monsters. This was another fact. The dark forest was also a place where monsters gathered the most. Master Tamar could have entrusted this task to me directly. Brando shook his head. Actually, I was careless. I forgot that the dark forest is the treasure trove that every alchemist yearns for. Actually, I think Master Tamar has his own concerns as well. Amandina smiled faintly and replied. What do you mean? You'll know if you ask Diameter. The noble girl rarely kept Brendel in suspense. Brando immediately looked at Falerne. The wild elf elder sister turned her head expressionlessly and shouted to her younger sister, Dia! Sister? The younger sister quickly ran back, but when she saw her elder sister's unfriendly expression, she obediently maintained her distance and asked carefully, Is something the matter, sister? My lord wants to ask you a question. Falerne replied. Sir Lord? Tia turned around and stared at Brando with widened eyes. Her sister was much scarier than this lord. Truth be told, compared to Falerne, she was more willing to get closer to this lord who often told her stories during their travels. In this regard, Falerne was a failure as an older sister. Tia, why did Master Tamar call you here? Brando asked. Collect the materials, my lord. Wasn't that normal? Brando turned around to look at Amandina. Amandina covered her mouth and giggled. She gestured to him with her chin, indicating for him to continue asking. Brando was slightly surprised. He thought for a moment and continued to ask, What materials do you have? That's what Master Tamar said. Tia began to recite, but she was immediately glared at by Falerne. The little girl's head shrank back slightly, and she became much more obedient. She pouted and whispered, It should be easy to find lesser magic crystals in the forest, so we should collect as many as we can. There are moon crystals, gold crystals. There are also magic plants, blood-stained roses and whiptail flowers. In terms of minerals, it's best if we can find mithril in the open, but sacred silver is also good. There's also frost iron, Nasser, or I heard that the dark forest has spring water that can preserve eternal youth, archangel's wings, dragon's poem, golden core. Stop. Brando quickly stopped Tia when he saw that she had no intention of finishing. The list of materials was fine at first, but it became more and more ridiculous as it went on. The spring water that could preserve eternal youth was already something that only existed in legends. Archangel's wings, dragon's poem, golden core. These were all divine artifacts. It seemed that Tamar really treated the dark forest as a treasure trove for the dwarves. All he had to do was to move the items out of the dark forest. If it was really that good, the humans would have swarmed into the dark forest a long time ago. Even though the dark forest was filled with countless treasures, it was equally dangerous. The outer regions of the dark forest were less dangerous and less mysterious. However, all kinds of minerals and rare magic plants were also rare. So, the latter part of Tamar's list was obviously just a pipe dream. However, Brando could understand Tamar's thinking. After all, not everyone had the chance to enter the dark forest and come out alive, let alone bring anything out. Staying alive in the dark forest was already a luxury. Not every lord would dare to throw their golden core into the bottomless dark forest. After all, no one knew if they would lose their men and not even be able to find anything. Brando dared to do so because he was familiar with the area north of the Karana Mountains. After all, he was once a player. Only players could risk their lives to explore the dark forest. But after giving it some thought, the young man suddenly had an idea. He was worried about the training plan for his young men. Now that he had Tamar's list, it was simple. He planned to spend most of his time on the road and the rest of the time on the map. Zhang Heng thought that he could divide these people into 3 groups, one for himself, one for Scarlet, and one for Coden. Then, after camping every day, each group would be graded based on their performance and the things they found. This way, not only would there be competition between groups, but it would also foster teamwork between groups. It was a good idea. Brendel made a draft in his mind, then turned around to inspect his men. But before he could do that, he heard a surprised shout, You're right. You're right. Muriel. Brando recognized Karglai's voice. He turned around and saw the young man dragging the red-robed Mordenkainen through the crowd and striding towards a young man who had just gotten off the carriage. Karglais? Why are you here? The young man was confused at first. Then he blinked his eyes and looked at his old friend. Brendel saw that the young man had long blonde hair that was rarely seen here, and his eyes were as blue as the sea. He was wearing a set of Kurlut's travel attire that was similar to Brendel's, and the long sword on his belt had been confiscated. He looked slightly slender and feminine, and stood there like a woman with long hair that reached her shoulders. But even if he was a woman, he was still a rich man's daughter. I understand now. The young man reacted and opened his mouth slightly in realization. Your father was defeated. So you came along as well. Hey, Carglass looked at his old friend and smiled casually. I thought you weren't here. I didn't think that Lord Maxon would lose even with you around. The young man's blue eyes were filled with worry as he furrowed his brows. Did you join them, Carglass? Yes, Carglass nodded nonchalantly. But then again, why are you here, Muriel? Of course, he knew who these young men were, but he was surprised to see his friend here. I was captured by those mercenaries. I was just passing by with my squire. Muriel blushed. You snuck out, right? Carglass saw through his friend's predicament. I didn't. All right, we all know about you. Don't pretend. Don't worry, I'll protect you. But I have to say you're in big trouble this time. My lady, you're going to the dark forest. Are you ready? Carglass suddenly showed a gloating expression. Don't call me that. Muriel suddenly got angry and glared at him, but then her eyes widened. I'm going to the dark forest? Why else do you think you're here? Carglass raised his head and looked at the forest. Oh right, I forgot to tell you. This is the border of the dark forest. Muriel's face turned pale and her body swayed, but Carglass quickly caught her. What are you doing? Isn't it just the dark forest? Besides, I'm still here. He reminded her in a low voice and pointed at the mercenaries around them, indicating that they should not make too big of a commotion. How can I go to the dark forest? Muriel was at a loss. Carglass, you have to help me. No, I think this is an opportunity, Muriel. Carglass shook his head. What opportunity? Muriel was confused. Didn't you always want to get rid of your bastard father? This is an opportunity. I think my new lord won't give in to your father, Carglass smirked. He suddenly felt that this was a good idea. But what can I do here? Muriel still did not understand. Besides, I don't want to go to the dark forest. There are monsters in the dark forest. We will die. Carglass touched his forehead and lowered his voice. My lady, you are a reserve priestess. Do you really need to be so timid? He suddenly realized something and looked around vigilantly. He lowered his voice and whispered something into Muriel's ear. Muriel was puzzled at first, but soon her eyes lit up and she nodded vigorously. Brando watched as Carglass and the young man walked to the side. Their voices were getting softer and softer until they could no longer be heard. But he did not listen too much. Once they entered the dark forest, these two sneaky fellows would not be able to do anything. He had plenty of time to slowly observe them. But what made Brando curious was that Carglass' friends could only be nobles. The young man's temperament seemed to confirm this point. But why were there nobles among the young men he recruited? Brando was not arrogant enough to think that the nobles and abbeys would support him at this time. Unless they did not want to lose their heads, they would be in big trouble when Count Randner came to settle accounts with them in the future. He turned around and looked at Amandina with a puzzled expression. Who are these people? Nobles. I heard that they are from the manor. You mean there are more than one of them? Brendel felt that the situation was getting more and more strange. He did not want his personal guards to be mixed in with unknown people. Even though the background of the manor's disciples could be considered clean, and perhaps the nobles around Ferber would not support him yet, he believed that it would not be long before that happened. But this situation was still a little strange. Amandina nodded her head. How did they come here? They snuck out. That's what the mercenaries said. Amandina replied, It seems like they came because of your reputation. Your reputation has spread far and wide. Interesting. Brando could not help but touch his cheeks and asked a little shamelessly, Am I that famous? Amandina raised her head and rolled her eyes at him. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 360. Traveling always seemed to be between anticipation and uneasiness. You would be caught in the middle when you were least prepared. The Tower people had a saying, the hardships of traveling can destroy all ambitions. This tribe, which was rich in merchants and adventurers, had a profound understanding of traveling. In the blink of an eye, Brando and his team had been in the Black Forest for a week. Although Coden had suggested that Brando set up camp outside the forest and set off after one night, Brando thought that they did not have time to waste. Besides, he was more experienced than Coden in the Black Forest, so there was no need to waste time. The depths of the Black Forest were like layers of emerald clouds. Supported by the black tree trunks near and far, they covered the sky densely. Light seeped through the gaps between the clouds, dyeing the surroundings green, while the backlit areas were almost inky black. Pillars of light shone in the darkness, and dust rose and fell under the light. Spots of light fell on the knotted roots. Under the roots, the emerald green pool in the forest was calm, and ripples would occasionally appear when a water spider slid across the surface. Light and darkness intertwined, outlining a quiet and strange scene. But it was actually close to evening. Brando was holding a notebook, and on it were various notes that were emitting fluorescent ink. Black mage, moonshine, four-leaf clover, witch's misery. Black mage symbolized mystery in the secret language of the witches, and was used to extract the state of mind for meditation. Using level 3 alchemy could obtain breath of tranquility, which was the main ingredient of meditation incense. Meditation incense was a popular item in the Amber Sword, and it allowed the practice of mystic-type professions to achieve twice the effect with half the effort. Under the shroud of mist in the quiet room, it was easier to understand the mysterious existence in the dark. This was better reflected in the psychic incantation. In the game, it increased the speed of gaining EXP by 5%. As for level 7 alchemy, he could extract one of the lowest level 2 materials in the Amber Sword, a product called Mysterious Essence. It could be consumed directly to increase one's bloodline, but it could only be used once. Moonshine was a mage's flower which nurtured mana. Consuming it directly would restore about 1 mana. However, after level 5 alchemy extraction, pure mana water could be obtained. Together with the bottle, it would be a beginner mana potion. Four-leaf clover represented luck. It was rare in the wild but not rare in the Black Forest. This plant could be used in almost all magic potions to increase the success rate. However, Brando knew of a unique method that could be used to extract the essence of luck using level 8 alchemy. It could be used in all kinds of alchemy, including forging and the creation of magic arrays. The witch's pain was probably the material of some kind of poison, the agony poison. This kind of poison with a distinct smell was inferior in the eyes of the nobles who were good at scheming. It was worthless. However, that was not how it was actually used. The cultists used it as a dual element of suffering and poison, to summon beings from the lower realms. The infernal demons, Lord of Suffering, or the Queen of Malice. The witch's bitter plant was strictly prohibited by the rules of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, but these rules couldn't stop those who really knew the value of this plant, the disciples of the Black Flames and the Sheep's Head disciples. They were willing to pay a high price or even murder to get this plant from others. Of course, Brando was not necessarily afraid, so he kept this plant. These were the results of more than 40 young men under him this week. In fact, these young men had nothing in the first 3 days of entering the Black Forest and complained incessantly. However, Brando naturally didn't let them go on an excursion. As long as someone slacked off, there would naturally be mercenaries who would mercilessly drive them forward with a whip. Every day at dawn, the young men would be awakened by the mercenaries. Some of them tossed and turned in the cold and damp environment of the forest, unable to fall asleep and might have just fallen asleep. However, the training schedule didn't care so much. Even if they dragged their tired bodies, they had to complete their daily homework. The content of the training was actually not complicated. In addition to the necessary hurrying, there was also group fighting, and some swordsmanship and fighting skills. Then, every evening before the camp, they would collect materials for Tamar. Of course, it was called cooperation. Survival training was also a very important part of the training. After a week, the number of materials recorded in the notebook had increased, and the value of the materials had obviously begun to increase. This meant that they were leaving the border of the Black Forest and entering the outskirts of the wilderness. Brando finished recording the second group's harvest and used a quill pen to mark a point on the parchment to indicate that the recording was complete. The 60 young men were divided into 6 groups, and each group was appointed a leader. The leader of the second group was a young man named Mars, who came from Fern's mercenary group. He was a lower iron-ranked expert, serious in handling matters and had strong organizational skills. However, he was a little rigid. But rigidity wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Brando raised his head and glanced at Carglass, who was not far away. The young man was leaning against a tree and wiping his long sword. This sword was a bit like the commanding sword of the year 377 before the November War. The sword had a wavy handle and the style of the sword leaned towards lightness. Brando liked this style very much, so the swords that were distributed to the young men were also of this design. The sword was the work of Master Bosley, so the quality was not a problem. Brando's design was obviously a success. The young men, regardless of whether they had used the sword before or not, loved the sword very much. This was far beyond the young man's expectations. However, he reacted quickly and immediately took the opportunity to elevate the sword to a symbol of honor. He told the young men that the sword was the symbol of the White Lion Guards. As long as he was a member of the White Lion Guards, he would have to live with this symbol of honor and the beliefs that the sword represented. The young men had privately asked Brando what the sword represented. Brando thought for a moment and replied, "Bravery, pioneering and unyielding, a sword that symbolizes integrity." This statement was widely accepted by the young men who worshipped knight and romance. Brando thought for a moment and recovered from this memory. He turned a page and gently moved the quill pen in his hand. On the upper right corner of the next page he wrote, 16th day of the month of slumber, clear. The black forest began to become dense. Sometimes we passed through places where not a trace of light could be seen even in the daytime. The treetops were filled with huge spider webs and fist-sized cocoons. Moths and polypods were densely packed on the tree trunks in the darkness. Strange thorns began to appear in the forest, such as the witch's pain. This means that the team is gradually leaving the forest border area. We saw traces of monsters for the first time in the whole day. From the shape and the traces left behind, it should be black wolves. At this point, the young man's quill stopped, and the tip of the quill gently left the paper. Magical creatures were a reflection of the distortion of magic power in the prime material plane. They were divided into several categories, including ferocious beasts, corrosive creatures, warp creatures, shadow beasts, abominations, gods and demons or nightmares. Black wolves were a type of shadow beast. Shadow beasts were relatively low-level monsters, but even these low-level monsters could reach as high as level 25. The black wolf had a pitch-black body, blood-red pupils and white dagger-shaped fangs. It was difficult for physical damage to deal with it in battle because the wounds of shadow creatures healed very quickly. However, its fangs could easily pierce through any kind of armor with an armor level lower than 2. In other words, there was no armor below plate armor that could withstand a blow from these monsters. Even plate armor could only rely on the chest and back plate, which had the highest defense, to barely withstand a blow. However, Brando did not announce this news. The Guardians tacitly chose to remain silent. They wanted to see how the young men would react to a sudden attack after a week of training, especially combat training. As for the danger, it was negligible. In front of any gold-ranked existence, these black wolves were no different from the most docile puppies. This is the 7th day in the forest, Brando. He finished writing this paragraph and looked around. The forest was not a peaceful scene. The young men were divided into 6 groups and fighting 12 stone leopards created by the Howran Gaia. The 6 obsidian leopards were either squatting or lying on their stomachs not far away, lazily watching the battle. They covered their noses with their paws and squinted their eyes. They did not seem to be interested in the battle between their own kind. They did not understand why the humans were fighting so happily. Their own kind obviously did not use their full strength. They looked left and right, thinking that if they were in the battle, they would have bitten off someone's neck. Of course, the young men did not seem to realize that these seemingly docile cats were interested in their necks. Otherwise they would have shuddered. But at this moment, they felt even more uneasy when they saw Scarlet, Coden, and Gaspard standing at the side. The captain of the security cavalry was the commander of the mercenaries. It could be said that the mercenaries' duties were the heaviest. Other than supervising, they also had to act as protectors. At least when they first entered the forest, the mercenaries had seen the young men trying to sleep on the wet ground more than once. They were responsible for patrolling at night, kicking the young men up with their boots and lifting their blankets to show them the centipedes and venomous snakes that were as thick as an arm. Needless to say, this method was very effective. Many of the young men were scared out of their wits, and after that, they obeyed the orders of the mercenaries. However, Gaspard now had another job, which was to score the young men's performance in the battle. The group with the lowest score would be sent on a 3-mile cross-country trip. 3 miles was nothing in the plains, but in the Black Forest it could be fatal. Leaving in the evening, sometimes you would not be able to return until midnight. As for dinner, you would have to hope that your companions would leave something for you. Of course, there was usually no hope. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 361. 3 miles was nothing on the plains, but in the Black Forest, it could cost a man his life. Leaving in the evening would sometimes take him until midnight. As for dinner, he could only hope that his companions would leave something for him to eat. Of course, there was no hope. The 3 judges were also a little distracted. Even Gaspard could see that these young people did not perform well, let alone Scarlet and Coden. In Coden's eyes, these young people were like children in a fight. They lacked tactics and were not organized. In short, Coden could only say one thing: they were still far from it. Brando shook his head, but he knew that this was not something that could be rushed. At least these young men were much better than before. At first they did not even dare to fight with the stone leopards. They had to rely on the mercenaries' boots to guide them forward. After a while they were able to hold off the stone leopards for a while. Now they could fight for at least 10 minutes. Their progress was fast. The Black Forest was indeed a good place to train people. He looked at them for a while and turned back to the other side of the forest. The Druids' camp was in that direction. Those guys who played with tree bark were as unsociable as ever. They met up with Brando on the second day after he entered the forest. There were 7 of them, including the Grey Raven Archdruid. Although the Druids were eccentric, Brando still admired them. At least they kept their word. This time, the Druids brought over 100 young men, including 10 elders, to assist in the defense of Abes. They also promised Brando that they would help Tonajal with the agricultural work in the coming year. Brando did not know how many Druids there were in the forest, but judging from the fact that the Archdruid promised to send over 300 of them to Abes, there should be a lot of them. These people would be a great help to him. The Druids were very good at building a city's defense. They planted thorny walls under the city walls, reinforced them with vines, and also had a bomb fruit and spells like quicksand. It could be said that 100 Druids were more useful than an entire army in a defensive battle. However, Brando could see that the Druids were still wary of him. At least this time, the Druids were all nature manipulation sorcerers. They should be from the outer circle of the Thorn Circle. None of them were from the Beast Spirit Circle, which worshipped the spirit of nature. Thinking of this, he smiled slightly. Ordinary people might not be able to see the difference, but he was very clear. Among the 12 outer circles of the Druids, the Circle of Flame, the Circle of Storm, and the Circle of Beast Spirit were the 3 with the strongest defensive abilities. The Circle of Thorns, on the other hand, was quite proficient in defensive spells. Thus, the intentions of the Druids were clear. But he was not in a hurry. There would be plenty of time in the future. He closed the travel journal and put away the quill. Then he took out a pale yellow leaf from his pouch. This was the evening primrose. These low-level materials were easily available in the Black Forest, and Brando could use them to practice alchemy. As described before, in the Amber Sword, civilians could raise their alchemy to level 5, while nobles could raise their alchemy to level 7. In fact, ever since he received the Princess Regent's reply, Brando's status on the interface had changed from civilian to noble, and even a lord. A lord could even raise his alchemy to level 8. Unfortunately, this status came a little late because before that, Brando had already reached the level of an elementalist. An elementalist was the main profession of a mystic profession. Under this profession, alchemy could be raised to level 10, which was far beyond the status of an ordinary noble. Brando held the evening primrose in his palm. The shape of this evening primrose was rare, and the glossy color was far better than the same species that grew in other areas. Although the Black Forest was dangerous, it was worthy of being called the treasure trove of alchemists. Then the young man slightly moved his mind, and a scarlet magic circle immediately appeared in his palm. After a few days of practice, and after wasting countless materials, Brando was now very proficient in blood refining. Although this thing could still be used to simply extract materials or synthesize some small things, at least Brando did not have to draw a magic circle on the ground in advance and make a cut on his hand to bleed. Not to mention the convenience, just the time saved was immeasurable. But, except for those monsters hiding in the dark, he was probably the only one who dared to use a forbidden spell so blatantly. When the scarlet magic circle became obvious, the evening primrose began to vaporize in his palm, and then a drop of crystal clear water was left. But it was not a drop of water, but a droplet-shaped crystal. Magic essence. Dissolve 10 units of this thing in water, and it could make a bottle of lesser magic potion. This thing seemed simple, but in fact, it required the support of at least level 5 alchemy. In the Amber Sword, this was probably the best alchemy product that a commoner could make in their lifetime. Of course, if you could stand out from the ordinary and become an alchemist, it would be a different story. A low-level alchemist apprentice could raise their alchemy to level 8, the same as a lord, and after becoming an official alchemist, they could raise their alchemy to level 15. After level 15 they would reach the peak of the Master Realm, and they would no longer be calculated according to the usual channels of skill EXP. After Brendel finished refining the mana essence, he extracted the luck essence from the 4-leaf alfalfa a few more times. Unfortunately, the cost of using high-level techniques at a low alchemy level was huge. After failing 6 times in a row, he barely succeeded once by relying on luck. But this time he did not get a finished product, but something called incomplete luck aura. Brando put the cloud of mist into a bottle, but suddenly felt a chill down his spine. He turned around and saw Falerne looking at him with a displeased expression. Refining the luck essence required 10 pieces of 4-leaf alfalfa. Even though they were common in the dark forest, it took a lot of effort to find them in a large field of alfalfa. Apparently, even the wild elf girl could not stand Brando's prodigal behavior. "My lord," the wild elf sister calmly warned him, "we wild elves have a saying, before you learn to run, it is best to learn to walk." Brando thought that the humans also had this saying, but he could not wait to level up his skills so slowly. If he had used the skill EXP earlier, he could have directly increased his alchemy to level 10, but now he looked at the empty skill EXP column and could only sigh. He had no choice but to use this stupid method. Of course, in the past few months, the young man had continuously obtained the elite template, entered the gold realm, and became a level 20 elementalist. It seemed that he should have a lot of free skill EXP, but in reality that was not the case. Sometimes plans could not keep up with changes. When Brando left the Shaflun silver mine, he released the female knight Orthlis's spirit seal from the supposedly authentic ring of the Wind Empress. After that, he got an opportunity. An opportunity to increase the level of Erwin's military swordsmanship to level 15. Of course, Brando could not refuse such a good opportunity, because after reaching the peak of the master level, the benefits of leveling up a skill were earth-shattering. In fact, the skills in the Amber Sword were set in such a way. In the first 5 levels, if the benefits of leveling up a character were about 1, then after reaching level 5 or higher and entering the expert level, the benefits of leveling up a character were about 2 to 3. After level 10 it was called the master level, and the benefits of leveling up in the master level were at least 5. However, the skill experience required to reach level 5 was 10 times that of the previous 10 levels, and the master level also had requirements for the profession. Skills that were not of the profession could never reach the master level. As for the formula for leveling up after level 15, no one had calculated in detail because different professions and skills had different benefits, but it could be concluded that it was between 15 to 20. In other words, after reaching the peak of the master level, the benefits of leveling up a skill were almost 3 times that of leveling up a skill at the master level. The gap was shocking. Unfortunately, when a skill reached the master level, the channel for investing experience in the skill would turn gray, and from then on, the skill could only be leveled up through practice and inspiration. As for the probability, most of it depended on one's face, or one's understanding of the skill. A level 16 skill was called the Realm of Creation, which meant that it contained a character's unique understanding and pioneering experience of the skill. Under normal circumstances, if a character could invest a skill to level 16, it would be their core skill. And if a character could invest a skill to level 17, then they could indeed be called a grandmaster in this field. Whether it was an NPC or a player, they could at least leave their name in history. As for level 18 and level 19, at least Brando had only heard of them but never seen them. Although players often joked that perhaps with the upgrade of the Amber Sword, the average level of the players would continue to increase, and maybe in the future there would be level 20 and 30 skills called the Realm of Gods, but Brando also knew that it was just a beautiful dream. Brando didn't even think about leveling up to level 16 for the time being. His Erwin military swordsmanship was stuck at level 13, and every level after that required nearly 500 skill experience, which was a huge expense. Before he considered the future path of training, he wouldn't be so extravagant as to invest the experience. However, since the appearance of the soul-sealed knight Orthlis, things seemed to have taken a turn for the better. After the female knight imparted some of her personal swordsmanship insights to Brando, he received a system prompt. Erwin military swordsmanship additional level unlocked. P.S. Let's count the votes, students. The awesome content is coming soon. You've been working hard this month, rolling on the ground begging for votes. Also, do you think there will be an explosion at the end of the month? To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.gdn.com. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 362. Erwin military swordsmanship level up. Of course, the young man understood what it meant. It meant that he could add another level of experience after reaching the peak of master. This way, Erwin military swordsmanship would be able to reach level 16 steadily. However, from level 13 to 15, Erwin military swordsmanship only required 2,000 experience points, but from level 15 to 16, it required 5,000 experience points. That was almost all of Brando's free experience points. He had happily chosen the 16 volumes of Erwin military swordsmanship, but he soon had to face the consequences. Now he had no experience points and had to rely on skill proficiency to level up. Fortunately, the dark forest was rich in materials, and using high-leveled alchemy skills to increase one's proficiency in alchemy was very effective. After obtaining the incomplete aura of luck, Brendel saw that his alchemy level had increased by a small notch and steadily reached level 7. At level 7 he had mastered advanced potioneering and synthesis circles. Advanced potioneering was the basic technique of making alchemy potions, and alchemy was one of the advanced potions. Its effects were powerful, but its materials were also rare. Brando looked at the young men not far away. He had a few potions that could increase their strength, and some were even useful for himself. For example, the potion that increased the capacity of the fire element pool by 5 slots. It was a pity that he lacked the main ingredients. If only I had dragon blood moss, Brando muttered to himself. What's that? Falern asked. Legend has it that where the giant dragon fell, red blood with a foul stench overflowed and eventually flowed into an ancient pool. Beside the pool grew a thick layer of bright red moss, which was the dragon blood moss. Dragon blood moss can be used to make dragon strength potions, Brando replied. Falern understood. The dragon strength potion was as famous as the dragon itself, especially for warriors. It could increase a person's physical strength, and it was equivalent to 2 to 3 years of physical training for a normal person. Of course, she didn't know that according to Brando, the dragon strength potion could directly increase strength and constitution by 5 energy ranks. It could allow a normal person to enter the Iron Realm in an instant. This was something that was commonly used to train armies, and even the nobles were eager to get their hands on it. Its price in the black market was very high, and each bottle was worth about 10,000 Tor coins. In fact, it was not worth it to use 10,000 Tor to train an iron-ranked soldier, but considering the time saved, the dragon strength potion was indeed worth the price. However, Brando did not intend to make a fortune out of it. First of all, the south of Erewhon, including the Black Forest, did not produce dragon blood moss. Secondly, the mana tide was coming soon. When that happened, all kinds of potions and magical items would plummet in price. He would only be asking for trouble if he interfered with the business of these things. Brando even warned the Roman lady not to pay attention to any magic-related goods. But he did not expect the merchant lady to know about the mana tide. What made Brando relieved was that she did not know that the mana tide was coming. Otherwise, he would have doubted the identity of her aunt. My lord knows how to make that kind of thing? Falern asked. Level 7 alchemy, just enough to pass the threshold, but the success rate will not be high. Brando looked in the direction where the young men had defeated the 12 stone leopards. They were given a short break, but soon Falern and Coden were going to teach them something new. The old swordsman was mainly responsible for explaining the key points of Erewhon's military swordsmanship, while Scarlet was more direct. She directly defeated the 2 groups she was in charge of and let the young men experience what they were lacking. Level 7 alchemy? Falern frowned as she listened. She wondered if the students of wizards or wizards were all so strange. But Brendel was her lord and she would not say it out loud. I meant this level of alchemy. Brando seemed to be used to correcting himself, and he changed his words without a trace. In my hometown, there are not many people who know how to make this kind of thing. Falern frowned. The dragon strength potion can be sold for more than 3,000 Lopez gold coins in the auction house. The most we mercenaries can do is look at it. 3,000 Lopez gold coins were worth more than 15,000 Tor coins. But I really want to hear the stories of your adventures. Brendel sighed at the high prices of Lopez as a trading port and replied casually. My lord, you know it's fake. It's just a memory that has been created. But it can also be said that it's real. The memories of thousands of Lopez mercenaries have been gathered together, but they have formed a unique one, and that is you. You are real in my heart. The young man turned around and looked at the expressionless maid. Thank you, my lord. Falern replied lightly, we adventure to make money and improve ourselves. But the money we earn as mercenaries is not enough to afford these luxuries. Actually, the dragon strength potion is not a high-grade potion. Brando replied. But he knew that the wild elf girl was telling the truth. Although the dragon strength potion was not a high-grade potion, Brando only knew that in this era of the Amber Sword, a dragon strength potion recipe was worth at least 3 million Tor coins. This was the first chapter of the game, The Empire of Birth. There were still 5 years before the second chapter, War and Chaos. It was the last period of time before the most powerful magic tide in history. In the game, this period of time was called the Age of Withered Magic. But it was not far away. Falern looked at him and did not say anything. If we want to buy a suitable weapon, we have to think about it over and over again. Our armor is sewn and mended by ourselves. Then she continued to answer, her eyes quietly looking ahead. The life of a mercenary is very tough. We lick the blood on our blades, but we don't necessarily lead a drunken life. Everyone is. Brando replied. Be it nobles, kings, or merchants, no one has the right to be superior to others on this scale just because of their high status or wealth. No one can be satisfied for a long time. Happiness is only temporary. Pain and sorrow accompany a person for a lifetime. Neither of them continued. They both had their own answers to what life was for. At this time, Brando heard heavy footsteps behind him. Then he turned around and saw the huge figure of the Fireclaw lizard man Lord Ropar looming behind a mangrove tree. Its dark red skin and mottled dark scales were no different from the surrounding mangrove bark, forming a natural cover. But Brando saw the look in the lizardman's pale yellow prismatic eyes. It was a look of vigilance with a hint of inquiry. The young man was startled and asked, "What's the matter, Ropar?" Brando summoned the lizard man lord on the second day after entering the forest. It was not easy to explain why this thing was left in the territory, so it was better to keep it by his side for the time being. Not only did he summon Ropar, he also summoned the Fireclaw spearmen. A squadron of 30 of them. Originally, they were only at the peak of Black Iron, but when Ropar was on the field, it provided a special ability. When the Fireclaw Lord is on the field, all Fireclaw tribe members on the field will have one combat counter added. This card was forcefully changed to Fireclaw Spearman. The Fireclaw Spearmen had the strength of a lower silver. With a creature level of 32, they were almost on par with the mercenaries of Lopez who were attached to Vientiane Forest. As for the Fireclaw Lizardman tribe, Ropar and his 30 subordinates were mainly responsible for guarding the periphery. Brando occasionally instructed them to let one or two wild beasts come in to test the reaction of the young men. So far it seemed to be going well. Ropar looked at the young lord and did not say anything. He bent down and placed a stone in Brendel's hand. This creature was almost 2.5 meters tall, and its width was only a third less than its height. When it bent down, Brendel could feel the oppressive aura that assaulted his face. But when Brando took the stone, he was stunned. It looked like a piece of crystal. It was completely transparent, and the crystal lattice pattern emitted a faint light. It seemed to be absorbing light, to the point that it became an impure black. The crystal was cold to the touch. Brando was shocked. Where did you find this? This was not a crystal but a scale of a war basilisk. A pond. Ropar was silent, but he used 3 fingers to gesture to let Brando understand what he meant. He told Brando that Amandina and Tia had found the pond and found a small piece of scale in it. This meant that there was a war basilisk nearby. War basilisks were the descendants of the sea monster Hydra. They once lived in large numbers on the land, but were later driven to the wilderness by humans. There were many variants of war basilisks. For example, the Dark Elves raised shadow 9-headed war basilisks across the Kalenga Mountains and the entire peninsula. In the semi-civilized areas in the south, the barbarians who lived in the swamps worshipped the 5-headed war basilisks as gods. However, 3-headed war basilisks were generally equivalent to beginner gold-ranked creatures. 5 of them were upper gold-ranked creatures. 9 of them were elemental awakened, and the strongest 12-headed war basilisks were said to have a bronze body. Brando was interested. It was said that the scales on the war basilisk's chest were blessed by the sea monster Hydra, so it was an extremely precious alchemy material. Even though the war basilisk's blood was not as good as dragon's blood, it was at least a grade higher than dragon's blood moss. It could be used to make dragon strength potions, and the effects were even better. Thinking of this, the young man stood up. He clapped his hands at Coden, Scarlet, and the group of youths in the distance to attract their attention. There's work to do. Author's note. Someone asked this question. Yes, level 15 to 25 is the Holy Realm. After 25, it is called the Divine Realm, but no one has ever reached it. Also, Brando's level 16 plus 2 does not mean that he is level 18. The plus 2 is an additional bonus. At lower levels, it can be counted as 1 level. After reaching the Grandmaster Realm, it will only increase by 10%. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 363. When Brando found the basilisk, Amandina and Tia were hiding in the bushes, admiring the beautiful and mysterious creature. Of course, they did not dare to get too close, but peeked from a few hundred meters away. The noble lady actually came out to look for this little girl who was running around collecting materials for Tamar. However, when she and the lizard men of the Flame Claw clan met this little wild elf girl, the two of them discovered the quiet little pond in the forest together. Amandina recognized the scale. She had seen all kinds of monsters in books, and some of the books on natural history were dedicated to describing the basilisk. She had Ropar report to Brando about the basilisk while she led the others to continue forward. Soon they found the tracks left behind by the basilisk in the forest. It was a 5-headed snake lizard. The surface of its body showed incomparably beautiful lines at the intersection of light and darkness. It was filled with a sense of power. Its fine scales were ink black, but there were some places that revealed a faint green color. This was a venomous basilisk. Its defense and strength were not as good as other basilisks of its kind. It could not turn its body into mist like the shadow hydra, and it could not manipulate the elements like its ice or fire subspecies. However, it was one of the most difficult to deal with among the basilisks. It could even corrode magic alloys with its venom. Fortunately, Brando knew how to deal with this monster. He rushed out and said to the others, "You guys stay here and watch." He said this to the group of eager youths and then ordered, "Coden, Ropar, Scarlet, attack from the back. The 5-headed basilisk only attacks 180 degrees. I'll attract its venom." "That's too dangerous." The old swordsman pulled out his sword and followed behind. The basilisk was precious, and Brando had promised to give him a bottle of dragon strength potion. "Leave it to me." The youth pulled out Haurangaya, and the wind haste spell on the scabbard that Tamar had specially made for him was activated. His agility was increased by 50%, and his body sped up. As he said this, he entered the snake lizard beast's alert range. The 5-story-tall behemoth also discovered the intruder from 200 meters away. Its third head raised and its conical mouth opened wide. Brendel did not forget the experience of fighting against these creatures. He saw the monster's mouth open and frowned, then rolled to the side. A black arrow of venom missed him by a hair's breadth. The venomous liquid streaked through the forest like a long dragon. The trees in front of it were corroded and emitted white smoke. Some even burned because of the large amount of heat. Finally, the venomous arrows that did not hit the target shot into the forest. The trees in the forest withered and turned yellow at a speed visible to the naked eye. The basilisk spirit, the youths who wanted to try their skills, but when they saw this scene their faces and some even cried out. "By the name of Martha." The young man named Mordenkainen by Brando stared blankly at the lord who dodged left and right, and calmly avoided the 5 venom arrows. His heart was full of nervousness and surprise. He had heard of many legends about the youth, and some of them were too miraculous and unbelievable to be believed. But these were incomparable to the facts he had seen with his own eyes. His mouth was wide open and suddenly he heard someone beside him ask, So strong, the Lord said that one day we can be like this too? Is this true?" The person who asked this question was obviously stunned. He could not help but pull his companion next to him. Muriel, whose sleeve was pulled, blushed and moved aside. "Muriel?" The man was stunned. "What's wrong with you?" "No, nothing." Muriel shook his head vigorously. He looked at the other side and whispered, "The Lord is at least gold tier. I think it will take us at least a few decades to reach his level." "A few decades, but the Lord looks at most 20 years old." "The Lord is a genius, can you compare?" "That's true, but a few decades is too long." "That's gold tier." One of the young men, who was originally a mercenary, immediately mocked. "Do you think he's a grass in the field? Do you know the reserve knight of the Holy Cathedral? As long as you have gold tier strength, you can enter the reserve knight of the Holy Cathedral." Many people in the crowd sucked in a breath of cold air. The Knights Templar's reserve members were people they could only look up to in the legends. They were existences that were even higher than Groton. Another person said, "Don't even talk about gold tier. As long as you can reach silver tier, you can easily obtain the title of knight from the Lord." Even the lowest noble title of knight was full of temptation. "Then can we reach silver tier?" someone asked. Carglass finally snapped out of his daze. He felt that his lord must have laughed when he saw him rushing towards him with his sword. He was only at the pinnacle of iron rank, and yet he had to fight against a gold-ranked quasi-sword saint who was at the pinnacle of swordsmanship and possessed the strength of a gold-ranked warrior. Although the young man was thick-skinned, he could not help but feel a little embarrassed. "We can definitely reach silver tier." He glanced at the others and answered. "Are you sure, Carglass?" Maria asked curiously. "It's difficult for an ordinary person to reach silver tier. You still need to have a certain amount of talent, right?" Don't you think you're improving very quickly? Kargleis asked. Everyone was stunned. Is that so? They were scolded by Coden every day as idiots. The red-haired girl with a long ponytail who beat them up every day shook her head whenever she saw them. Even though the Lord looked kind, gentle, and easy to talk to, he only smiled at them without saying anything. Now, they even thought that they were idiots. Otherwise, how could the Lord and Miss Scarlet, who looked like they were in their teens or 20s, be so much stronger than them? Kargleis shook his head. He knew that this was not the problem. Recently, he felt that since he returned to his father's side from the Lord of the Palace, his swordsmanship, which had stagnated for a long time, seemed to be showing signs of improvement. He was also surprised to find that his absolute strength had begun to show signs of reaching silver tier after only a week in the dark forest. Do you know what kind of swordsmanship the Lord is teaching you every day? He asked. Everyone shook their heads. Maria, Kargleis said. Maria frowned. I took a look. It should be the sanctum swordsmanship. Isn't that forbidden to be taught to outsiders? Someone shouted. The young men suddenly became quiet and looked at each other. It was not a small crime to teach the sanctum's secret swordsmanship to outsiders. But Kargleis shook his head. He did not care about the sanctum, and the sanctum did not care about a small fry like him. They had plenty of talented young men to choose from. Heaven's bearers and chosen ones. Compared to those favored by the heavens, he was just an ordinary person. He patted Maria's shoulder lightly. So, do you understand, Maria? I think I've made the right choice this time. Maria blushed. The others quieted down. They all heard what Kargleis said. While the young men were deep in thought, Brando was not as relaxed as they thought. The venom of the five-headed snake was far more terrifying than it appeared to be. Although Brando was not hit directly, he was still shuttling in and out. Soon, a row of notifications appeared on the green grid in his vision. Abnormal status. Brando had already passed through the 5th poisonous arrow. He knew that the basilisk needed some time to prepare for the next round of attack. He immediately gestured to Coden, Scarlet, and Ropar, who were behind him, to quickly move closer to him. At the same time, he also tried to lure the big guy to turn around. On one hand, he wanted to leave the area filled with poisonous clouds. As he moved forward, he quickly switched through the interface. It was not difficult for him, as it was a reflex action after thousands of repetitions. The interface first switched to the life status, and it showed the healthiest green color. This meant that although the poisonous cloud had begun to seep into his body, it had not yet caused any damage. This was because his constitution was still immune to the poison. Brando's constitution was over 100. If he was an ordinary person, he would have died a few hundred times. He immediately switched to the immunity panel. The resistance column was pale yellow. The resistance rate was about 87%, but it was still decreasing. At this rate, within 10 minutes, even if he was not hit directly, he would still be poisoned to death. As expected of an upper gold-ranked creature, it was not easy to deal with. In the game, the five-headed snake's attack interval was 1.5 minutes. This meant that the attacker had to hurry up and close the distance between them. However, the basilisk was very cunning. It also retreated while spitting. Brando was used to this tactic. He changed his direction and lured the five-headed snake to face him. This way it would be easier for Coden and the others to approach it from behind. The five-headed snake also realized this, but it could not do anything else. It could only growl angrily. 30 seconds later, Brando, Coden, and the others were within range of the five-headed snake. Brando activated charge and was the first to enter. He then jumped up and dodged the five-headed snake's whip-like tail sweep. Tail sweeps had always been reserved for dragons and wyverns. When the tail that was even sturdier than steel swept across the forest and cut the towering trees in half, the loud cracking noises could be heard for miles. All the spectators in the distance couldn't help but hold their breaths. Brando landed beside the basilisk's right front claw and raised Haurangaya. The battle had reached its climax. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 364. The battle had reached its climax. Brando raised Haurangaya with both hands and swung it at the five-headed basilisk's right front claw, which was as thick as a marble pillar. Despite its massive size, its movements were surprisingly nimble. The five-headed basilisk retracted its right front claw as if it had foresight. Brando's sword only hit its afterimage. However, the power of Haurangaya shattered the ground beneath the five-headed basilisk's feet. The dirt and stone slabs were pushed to the sides, and the center of the ground collapsed downward, forming a cone-shaped trench. The five-headed basilisk lost its footing, and its entire body tilted to the side. However, it was not easy for Brando to take advantage of the situation. The five-headed basilisk's 5 heads were like whips in the air, swooping down one after another to bite. The young basilisk kept retreating until it was more than 10 feet away from the five-headed basilisk. Coden, Scarlet, and Ropar, who were approaching the five-headed basilisk from behind, found an opportunity to attack. However, when Brando saw them approaching, he immediately shouted, "Be careful of the venom shield." Coden and Scarlet were startled. As they rushed forward, they saw a dark green liquid shield appear in front of them. Both of them were experienced, so they stopped abruptly. However, the old swordsman was obviously more experienced. When he stopped, he pulled out a dagger and threw it at the magic shield. Then, with a soft hiss, the dagger turned into a puff of white smoke before it could penetrate the venom shield. Martha above. The old swordsman rejoiced in his heart. Fortunately, Brando had warned him early. But how was he going to deal with this? Only the Fireclaw Lizardman Lord Ropar did not seem to have heard anything. The Lizardman Lord, who had been majestically pursing his lips, with a hint of coldness in his pale yellow eyes, crashed into the venom shield. The venom shield washed over his body, but it did not seem to have any effect on him. It only took away the dirt on his dark red scales. Poison immunity. Brando did not expect the Fireclaw Lizardmen to have such a trick up their sleeves. However, the five-headed snake lizard was also a lizard, or at least a reptile. Ropar and it could barely be considered the same species. It was reasonable for the same species to have some means to restrain each other. Ropar was out of everyone's expectation, including the five-headed Naga itself. The monster wanted to turn back, but it was too late. The Fireclaw Lizardman Lord used a double-headed sword as a weapon. He stabbed the sword into the five-headed Naga's right hind leg, and a flame burst out from the sword. The blood under the broken tendons and veins of the five-headed snake lizard was vaporized before it could splash out, forming a red satin mist that sprayed out. The monster raised its head in an instant, and its 5 heads let out a high-pitched scream at the same time. The sound traveled at least dozens of miles, and a flock of birds flapped their wings and flew out of the forest. While the five-headed snake lizard was injured, the venom shield suspended behind it fluctuated and then disappeared at the same time. Right now. Coden and Scarlet immediately realized this. They rushed in, but before they could even take 2 steps, they felt the ground under their feet give way. What is this? Scarlet was shocked. She saw countless green thorny vines sticking out of the broken ground. These vines broke out of the ground and curled towards her feet as if they were alive. Not only her, but the old swordsman Coden also suffered the same fate. Brando had just recovered from the five-headed Naga's attack, and of course he saw the situation that Scarlet and Coden were in. It was the five-headed Naga's poisonous vines, but he did not have time to answer. Instead, he used his sword to stop himself from falling back, and at the same time, pointed his left hand in front of him. At that moment, everyone saw bright green spots appear in the air behind Brando. However, they were not light spots, but small magic circles that appeared in the air. The magic circle took up half of the sky behind Brando, and it spread out like a pair of translucent green wings. Then, in the next moment, balls of green light shot out from the magic circle like cannonballs. The balls of light landed on the ground, leaped forward and flew up into the sky. The dense dots of light quickly gathered and formed a crescent shape. Brando threw out another card. Hundreds of golden holy swords surrounded the five-headed Naga in a semicircle. The youths in the distance were stunned. They had imagined the most beautiful swordsmanship and the most terrifying magic, but they had never imagined such a magnificent power. This was the power of their lord. Carglass looked at the scene with a strange expression. "Muriel, I feel like an idiot." Muriel lowered her head and blushed as she whispered, "Yes, you always have been." The five-headed Naga also felt threatened. It raised its head, and the 15 pairs of eyes on its 5 heads flashed with a ghostly green light. The thorns that were spreading towards Scarlet and Coden suddenly changed their direction. They quickly grew back and intertwined in front of the five-headed Naga, forming a dense thorny shield that was dozens of meters high. Attack! Brando roared at Coden. The huge monster could no longer turn back to save itself. At the same time, hundreds of holy swords in the air emitted a dazzling light. The intertwining golden beams of light burned down like fire from the heavens, and the thorns were reduced to ashes. The huge thorny shield was instantly pierced through, and then the beams of light continued to descend and collided with the venom shield. At the moment when the two collided, Beams of golden light immediately refracted on the surface of the shield, sprinkling a rain of light in all directions. The temperature of the venom shield also changed dramatically. The shield first turned red, then vaporized. Then a ray of light penetrated the shield, followed by a second, then a third. The venom shield finally collapsed, and the beam of light directly hit the five-headed Naga's hard skin. The same thing happened to the five-headed Naga's black crystalline skin. It refracted the light, turned red, and then burst open. The blood below turned into a red mist and rose into the air. The intense pain caused the Naga to roll around in the forest. At this time, Coden, Scarlet, and the Lizard Man Lord did not stop attacking. They dodged the five-headed Naga's hind legs and tail while trying their best to inflict wounds on the monster. Although they were both upper gold tier, the five-headed snake lizard was much less agile than the wind wyvern. However, the defensive ability of this demonic creature was daunting. Scarlet used all her strength to strike the monster's scales with lightning bolts that were dozens of meters long. However, most of the lightning bolts were unable to penetrate the monster's skin and could only leave a small burn mark. Coden's situation was not the same. Only the Fireclaw Lizard Man Lord could not attack from a distance. However, every strike of its sword was able to inflict real damage. Its method was quickly copied by the others. Coden and Scarlet also gave up on attacking from a distance. Instead, they stabbed the monster with their spears and swords. At the very least, they could bleed a little. Their method worked quickly. Although the five-headed Naga inherited the incredible regenerative ability of the Hydra, it was not unlimited. After losing too much blood, the monster started to feel lightheaded, and the attacks of its 5 heads slowed down. Brendel, who was in charge of drawing the enemy's firepower, felt a lot more relaxed. He dodged the enemy's whip-like neck and bite for the last time, and took advantage of the gap between the enemy's attack and rolled to the right side of the enemy's chest. Brando straightened his body and took a deep breath. Then he swung the White Raven sword with all his might. With the enhancement of level 16, +2, Erwin's military swordsmanship, as well as the terrifying enhancement of power burst, the sword aura created by the strike formed a whirlwind in the calm atmosphere. A white whirlwind appeared out of thin air. Like a dragon, it swept horizontally towards the five-headed Naga. The whirlwind stirred the air and formed white canine fangs that were almost 10 meters long. These white canine fangs bit into the five-headed Naga's injured chest and abdomen, causing blood to spurt out from the wound. But that was not the end. Haurangaya tore the earth apart with the same force as the whirlwind. Mud slabs that were more than 10 meters high were formed wherever the whirlwind passed. The ground in the center of the whirlwind cracked inch by inch, collapsing layer by layer. Although the five-headed Naga tried its best to dig into the ground with its forelimbs, it was still dragged into the cracks by the whirlwind. After the whirlwind of Haurangaya, the forest around Brando, Coden, Scarlet, and the Lizard Man Thane had changed. With Brando as the center, the ground in the cone-shaped area in front of him continued to collapse. It was as if a large-scale landslide had occurred on the flat ground. Half of the five-headed Naga's body was buried under the ground, while the other half was covered in wounds. It did not seem like it would make it out alive. Brando looked at the scene and sheathed his sword. The forest was silent. After the battle, the young people began to clean up the battlefield. Of course, before that, Falern and Tia used the whirlwind to clear away the poisonous clouds left behind in the forest to prevent careless people from accidentally entering the forest. However, the youngsters were still a little fearful at first. The power of this monster was far beyond their understanding. However, after personally coming to the side of this monster, they felt a little incredulous. It was as if they couldn't believe that someone could defeat such a monster. They surrounded the corpse that was several stories tall and discussed among themselves. Some of the braver ones even tried to touch the crystal-like scales of the five-headed Naga. None of them had ever seen anything like this before. Brando asked Falern to pry the scales off the five-headed Naga's chest. Although beasts did not drop any equipment, the law of luck could not be violated. The scales on the Naga's chest were called Hydra's Blessing. They were not as black as the scales on its back. Instead, they were green in color. Brando knew that this thing could be used in many ways. It was an important material for alchemy. It was a pity that he had damaged a lot of the scales in his last attack. He only managed to pluck 30 of them, which was enough to make a magic armor. Brando planned to make a breastplate, but before that, he asked Coden to lead the young people to search for the five-headed Naga's nest. Beasts did not drop any equipment, but there might be some good stuff in their nest. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 365. The five-headed basilisk's blood filled several containers. At the same time, the team that went to search for the monster's lair also received some news. The young men split into 6 groups and searched the forest. The group led by Carglass found the lair of the five-headed basilisk behind a moss-covered cliff in a valley about 2 miles away from the village. It was in a crevice under a slanted rock that was hundreds of meters long. The exploration team climbed down the valley until they reached the bottom. After parting the dense layers of vines that were as thick as an arm hanging down from the top of the rock, they discovered the stinky lair. The young men obeyed Brando's orders and did not explore the lair directly. Instead, they sent someone to report back. When Brando heard the news, he immediately put down the alchemy tools in his hands and rushed over to the lair with the others. The team passed through the dense forest and arrived at the top of the valley. Brando first observed the terrain. As mentioned in the information provided by the messenger, the huge rock in the valley seemed to have fallen from a towering cliff. However, it had been there for a long time. Other than the exposed white parts of the rock, it was covered with green vegetation. The deeper they went into the black forest, the less obvious the influence of the 4 seasons was. Tonajul was currently in the harsh winter season, but as they went south into the forest, the temperature rose day by day. The forest in the valley was so dense that it was like midsummer. In the distance, there was a mountain stream that formed a waterfall on the cliff. The water splashed like white silk. Brando and the rest went down the mountain. At the bottom of the valley, the young lord saw Carglass and his team. They were resting. Maria had sprained her ankle when she entered the valley. She was sitting on a rock beside the pool under the care of a few people. Brendel glanced at Maria. He already knew who she was, but he accidentally saw her bare calves. Her fat was well proportioned and her skin was snow white. Only her ankle was slightly red and swollen. He could not help but be startled. He quietly went to Carglass' shoulder and whispered, "Are you sure she's a man?" Carglass shook his head. "My lord, you know that the children of God do not have a gender. As long as I wear the divine robe, it doesn't make a difference whether I have an extra piece or not." The young man pointed at his chest with a wretched smile and answered in the crude and straightforward manner he had learned in the military camp. Brando coughed and asked, "Does that mean she's a woman?" Carglass shrugged. "I didn't say that. Ever since I met Maria, she has been wearing a robe or dressed as a man. I don't think anyone knows this secret except for her father or her wet nurse." Maria's father had wanted her to become a member of the clergy since she was very young. Isn't this a good thing? Carglass smiled mysteriously and replied, "My lord, let's go down and take a look." Brando nodded. He glanced at Maria again and then led the others into the valley. The nest of the five-headed snake lizard had always been in the deepest part of the crevice under the rocks. Although it was called a crevice, it was relative to the height of the rocks. As Brando walked, he parted the vines that were full of vitality. Many small lizards that he did not know the name of fled in all directions. He looked up and saw the crevice under the rocks that were at least 16 or 17 meters high. As for the top of the rocks, he could not see the top from where he stood. A waterfall fell from the edge, forming a water curtain at the intersection of light and darkness. There was a faint rainbow hanging on the water curtain. "It's beautiful," Amelia exclaimed as she looked at the rainbow. She felt a sense of security as Brando held her hand. "It's beautiful," Carglass said as he fanned his metal glove beside his nose. "It's just a little smelly." A nauseating stench overflowed from the depths of the crevice. Everyone looked in that direction and saw that the crevice, which was tens of meters wide, extended to an unknown depth. It was pitch black inside. Brando unsheathed Haurang Gaia and held it in his hand. The others did the same, and the sound of metal clashing could be heard from behind him. Only Coden lit a torch and the light became brighter, illuminating the potholes on the ground. Some of the broken rocks cast long shadows on the ground, like black lines that led to the depths of the crevice. "There's a cave in there." Coden pointed in that direction and said, "Hey, the terrain here is really strange. I'm surprised that the five-headed snake lizard could find a place like this to build its nest." Brando also saw that place. It was the deepest part of the crevice. The ground had begun to sink, forming a hole that formed the entrance to a huge cave. He could imagine that the crevice had already existed before the rock fell. The mountain stream on the cliff had broken through the weaker rocks and flowed into the underground river. After a long period of erosion, it had formed a huge hole. However, after the rock fell, it had once again covered the entrance to the cave. Coincidentally, it did not completely seal off the entrance, but left a crevice that could be entered. It had to be said that the terrain was indeed strange. Brendel gestured and everyone immediately walked in that direction. The stench was coming from the bottom of the cave. Everyone could see the green stains on the rocks outside the cave entrance. It used to be the entrance where the water from the stream flowed into the ground, but the moss had long withered away. The entrance to the cave was not small, and could even fit a 5-headed snake lizard in and out. Coden brought the torch close to the entrance, but under the illumination of the fire, the interior of the cave was still pitch black. They did not know how deep it was. Scarlet did not say a word and picked up a rock from the ground and threw it in. Bang! After a few seconds, the sound of something colliding came from the bottom of the cave. Everyone looked at each other. For a moment they didn't know who should go down first. Brando knocked on the entrance with Haurangaya and said to Amandana, "I'll go down and take a look. Wait for me here." "My lord," Karglai stopped him and said, "Let us go first." Brando pushed his hand away and chuckled, I won't hesitate to ask you to run errands. But compared to being familiar with this place, your experience is still lacking." He then turned to Falern and said, "Falern, come with me." The older wild elf sister froze for a moment and pressed her hand to her chest. "Me?" She put on a straight face. "I'm an elementalist, my lord." "That's not important. Don't forget, cleaning up the battlefield is your job." Brando smiled and replied, "Don't worry, I'll protect you." He had to admit that Softhand's luck was indeed very good. The cave was at least 100 meters deep, but Brendel saw something good the moment he reached the bottom of the cave. There was a spacious space at the bottom of the cave. It was obvious that the 5-headed snake lizard used this place as its nest. In the darkness, in addition to piles of rotten meat and bones, there were some withered twigs in the corner. Brando saw a large number of armor and weapon fragments in the gaps between the twigs. But that wasn't what he was looking for. What really caught his attention was a metal glove studded with fiery red gems. Brando's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure if that was what he was looking for. At this time, Falern, who had activated her wings of the wind, floated down from above. She flapped her wings and landed on the ground. She then folded her wings and looked around. She also saw the glove that was glowing in the dark at first glance. But she didn't ask. According to her logic, Brando would tell her if he wanted to. Brendel walked over and picked up the metal gauntlet. The green light network on his retina immediately changed, interweaving into rows of words in his vision. Crimson Blessing, Bahamut's Grip Glove Armor 2 Defense Fire Shield 5 Defense Attack with 10% Fire Damage Advanced Alchemy Circle. The young man couldn't help but praise Martha in his heart when he saw the properties. It really was the legendary alchemy glove. The level of this item was only fantasy, but in the Amber Sword, it was called a fantasy artifact. This was a pun, meaning the Crimson Blessing, Bahamut's Grip. It was not only a fantasy artifact, but it also meant that it was even rarer than a real artifact, so it was called a fantasy artifact. Of course, any fantasy artifact was just a price tag for a RMB warrior. But the price on the game's trading website was as high as 30,000 renminbi. It was enough to make an ordinary player like him look at it as nothing. But Brando never thought that he would get this glove in his first exploration of the dark forest in this world. Compared to the 5-headed snake lizard he had killed, this thing was like a piece of cake. He couldn't wait to put on the glove. But at this time he suddenly heard Falern whispering behind him. "Look over there, my lord." Brando turned around. Then he saw something he couldn't believe at the top of the circular nest made of branches. It was a snow-white, spherical object about the size of a coconut. It was a little dazzling in the dark underground. There were about 30 of them in the outer layer of the nest. "Damn. I'm going to be rich this time." Brendel exclaimed in his mind. Those were snake lizard eggs. There were at least 100 of them. The value of these eggs was enough to buy the whole of Tanajul. Brando's heart pounded. Those snow-white eggs were like a shining treasure trove in his eyes. The young man was stunned for a moment before he remembered something. He immediately beckoned to Falern. "Quick, call the people up there." The young lord took a deep breath. "We have to get these eggs out of here." To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 366. When the youths reached the bottom of the cave one by one, they immediately let out a series of strange screams. "Ah, this smell! I'm going to die. Heavens, this is poisonous gas." "Silence." The red-haired girl with a long ponytail shouted coldly, causing the youths to shut up. But she couldn't help but frown. The smell was indeed a little too strong. If the 5-headed basilisk was compared to a person, then it would be the sloppiest of them all. This monster's lair was filled with a pungent and nauseating smell, as if it was a huge cesspool. It was not an exaggeration to say that it was poisonous gas. Amandina, who had the weakest constitution, had already vomited several times. If not for Maria casting a purification spell on her, she would have fainted already. Coden was the last to reach the bottom of the cave. He immediately saw the silver-gray gauntlet on Brando's hand. The gauntlet was covered with scales, and the back of the gauntlet was inlaid with a fiery agate. The old swordsman was knowledgeable, and he immediately recognized the gauntlet. This can't be the Crimson Blessing, right? Brando smiled mysteriously. He was in a good mood. You guessed right, Master Coden. Is this really the legendary gauntlet that was used by Hero Shatharan? The old swordsman stared at the gauntlet as if all his attention was drawn to it. It can't be a fake, can it? Brando knew that the hero Coden spoke of was one of the most famous alchemists in history. He was famous because he was not only a master alchemist but also a dragon knight. Shatharan was the favorite of the fire dragon king Bahamut. Her travels with his golden fire dragon were still a legend that was widely sung by poets. However, the most famous thing about Shatharan was this gauntlet. This gauntlet was blessed by fire dragon king Bahamut, and was given to the hero as a symbol of his care. This was why the gauntlet was named the Crimson Blessing. Of course not. Brando moved his right hand, and the metal gauntlet made a rustling sound as it rubbed against each other. How do you know it's not? Coden looked at the gauntlet suspiciously. He did not believe that Brando's luck was so good that he could climb into a cavern and obtain the legendary equipment used by the hero. The legend of Shatharan was something that happened almost 300 years ago. After that, this gauntlet was lost in the land. As for whether it disappeared with the hero like in the legends, or whether it had been passed around several times, no one knew who had it. It was still a mystery. As for how it appeared here, it was unknown. Brendel did not say anything after hearing the old swordsman's question. He put his glove on Howran Gaya's hilt and pulled it out. Everyone saw a trail of flames bursting out from his gauntlet. The flames spread upwards and quickly engulfed his entire gauntlet and Howran Gaya. Coden of the Swords of the Soft, the Cato, the Cavern of the People of the Sto, the Cavern of the Conts. The surrounding youths were stunned. They stared at the scene with their mouths agape. Coden's eyes widened as well, but after a brief moment of shock, he still insisted on his opinion. It's similar, but there are many enchantments with fire effects. Coden said. For example, Flame Grasp, Fire Blade, and Flame Blessing. It doesn't have to be the Crimson Blessing's dragon's flame. Brendel smiled faintly. He swung his sword to the side of the cavern, and the flames on the sword vibrated and burst out in all directions. The flames burned in the air and formed a sound similar to a dragon's roar. Finally, the dragon-shaped flames left the sword and swept across the cavern wall. With a loud bang, the stone and sand fell down. Coden was completely convinced that this was the Crimson Blessing. Only the dragon's flame could be so powerful and have such a unique attack style. However, Brando's performance was not over yet. He extinguished the flames in his hand and sheathed Howran Gaya. Actually, the dragon's flame is not the strongest effect of the Crimson Blessing. Do you know Shatharan's other identity, Master Coden? Of course. Coden was still in shock. The Crimson Blessing was too famous. He blinked his eyes and took a deep breath. She's an alchemist after all. Yes, but the Crimson Blessing was given to her by the Fire Dragon King, Bahamut. It could be said that it was tailor-made for Shatharan. So, the strongest effect of this gauntlet lies in another aspect. As Brando spoke, he took out a scale blessed by Hydra. He flipped the gauntlet over, and a magic circle on the palm of the gauntlet lit up. Coden also saw the fire agates embedded in the Crimson Blessing light up one by one. Then the scale in Brando's hand flew into the air. The azure scale seemed to have been subjected to thousands of degrees of heat in an instant. It quickly softened in the air and liquefied into green-red water droplets. Brando's 5 fingers moved slightly, and the water droplets immediately gathered and slowly changed shape. Finally, they turned into a fiery red dagger. Then, the surface of the dagger began to cool at a speed visible to the naked eye. From the initial ripples, it gradually hardened. However, it did not cool directly. Instead, it rippled in layers as if someone was hammering on its surface with a hammer. In the end, the dagger completely cooled down. It was like a piece of hot metal, but the red color gradually darkened and turned into a dark green color. Brando clenched his fist, and the dagger fell into his hand. Did you see it? The young man asked with a smile. Coden gasped. Of course, he knew that this was alchemy. However, alchemy was not as magical as this. In Wand, Alchemy was a secret art passed down among the upper-class nobles, witches, and mystical professions. In the eyes of ordinary people, alchemy might seem mysterious, but it was also omnipotent. However, alchemy was a serious skill that combined enchantment and potioneering. Perhaps witches used alchemy to make all kinds of potions in a bubbling cauldron, or the craftsmen of Buga used alchemy to draw mysterious patterns on armors and weapons, giving them great power. However, the completion of a work required long-term and meticulous work. Apart from the extremely simple extraction of materials that could be done directly with some secret techniques, most alchemy work could only be completed in a quiet environment with complete tools. However, Brando's demonstration had completely changed everything. He had skipped the forging step and directly made a dagger with materials. What is this? Coden stared at the dagger in a daze. It's a high-level alchemy circle. In fact, the forbidden blood refining technique was developed based on the research of this alchemy circle, Brando replied. The wizards of Buga have more complete information, but their imitation is much simpler. Not to mention, with the blessing of divine power, the power of this circle is much higher than what it says. The young lord thought for a moment. Generally, advanced magic circles can only be used to refine products below level 10 alchemy. Apart from alchemy in the general sense, if it involves the field of making magic items, it can only enchant the finished product. But this gauntlet doesn't have so many restrictions. As you can see, it can even be used to refine items below level 13. Coden didn't understand the meaning of level 10 and level 13 alchemy, but at least he understood. Now that he understood, the mystery of the advanced alchemy circle didn't seem as intense anymore. He had heard of advanced alchemy circles. The old swordsman shook his head and thought for a moment. I think I understand. But my lord, do you think this is the most important function of the gauntlet? He shook his head again. Actually, I think the dragon's flame is more useful. Brando was stunned. It was only then that he realized that an NPC's thoughts were different from the players. Players were not used to spending all day in an alchemy lab, so they naturally thought that such a convenient item was a godly item. Brando saw the old swordsman's somewhat disapproving gaze and could not help but feel pity for the gauntlet. He thought to himself, I met a guy who doesn't know what's good for him. He then thought, if Coden knew that the market value of the gauntlet in the Amber Sword was about 7 billion Tor in Erewhon's currency, which was about half of the total wealth of this ancient kingdom in a year, he wondered what kind of expression he would make. Coden patted the gauntlet and was about to say something when a young man suddenly shouted, My lord, are these really the eggs of that big guy? 5-headed Hydra lizard's eggs. Coden was already shocked enough when he saw the crimson blessing. He thought that he would be able to remain calm no matter what he saw today, but when he heard this sentence, he could not help but be shocked. Martha above, what did the eggs of the venomous lizard beasts mean? A large number of future top-tier war beasts? The 9-headed Hydra beasts were regarded as top-tier weapons by both the Dark Elves and the Barbarians. Although the 5-headed Hydra beasts were much inferior, they were still gold-ranked beasts after reaching maturity. The old man immediately turned his head. Eggs? Where are they? He asked, but he was immediately petrified. He saw more than 100 white eggs placed in the pile of branches. Coden rubbed his forehead as if wondering if he was still dreaming. These. He gulped. Are these the eggs of the 5-headed Hydra beasts? He asked Brando tentatively. Brando nodded. In fact, when he saw the eggs, his reaction was not much better than the old swordsman's. Martha above, these eggs were much more valuable than the gauntlet on his hand. Of course, this was not referring to their value in the game, but their value to him at this moment. What are you going to do with these eggs? Coden turned his head stiffly and asked. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 367. How should we deal with them? Brando asked. This was indeed a problem. This wealth was too precious. It gave people a feeling that it was not safe to just leave it there. They had to go deeper into the Black Forest to find the legendary Valhalla, but leaving these eggs in the Black Forest did not make them feel safe. Kid, Coden said in a slow and heavy tone, I suggest that you escort these eggs back to your territory. Brando shook his head. Coden stared at him. What is so attractive about the Black Forest that it's even more valuable than these eggs? Brando thought for a moment. Valhalla's value was immeasurable, and it was even more valuable than these eggs. However, it didn't mean that he could give up on these eggs. He thought for a moment and replied, I've thought of a way. It's best to leave someone here. Leave someone here? The old man shook his head. Who? This is the Black Forest. It's precisely because it's the Black Forest that I thought that there wouldn't be many outsiders here. There might be some monsters in the forest, but the five-headed lizard's aura is still here, so low-level monsters won't enter. Brando replied, as for high-level monsters, they have their own territories and won't wander around easily. Moreover, this is the outskirts of the Black Forest. The five-headed lizard is already at the top of the food chain here. Coden suddenly became alert. You're telling me so much. Do you have any ulterior motives? Brando smiled mysteriously. I've never thought that I'm with you. Aren't you afraid that I'll take these eggs and run away? Coden could not help but ask. Of course I can't take all of them, but one or two shouldn't be a problem. This is the Black Forest, Master Coden. Brando smiled warmly. Without a druid to lead the way, can you walk out of here? The old man was stunned and raised an eyebrow. What, are you threatening me? The young lord quickly shook his head and replied with a smile. Of course not, I'm just joking with you. Actually, I've already thought about it. I plan to leave a small group of Fireclaw lizard men here. They should be enough to guard against wild beasts that barge in. Besides, that kind of thing is just in case. Coden snorted. That's good. Don't make fun of me, kid. However, even though he said that, he still felt a little disappointed. Brando's actions showed that this young man still didn't believe him. While the two were talking, a commotion suddenly came from the depths of the cave, interrupting their conversation. Brando turned around and saw a young man stumbling out from that direction. He recognized the young man. He should be part of the third team, Cargly's men. He had sent the third team to explore deeper into the cave to see if there was anything else inside. Did he discover something? Brando had originally guessed that the depths of the cave should be connected to an underground river. He had sent people to check it out with the mentality that nothing would go wrong. There might be some magic materials such as fluorescent moss or something. However, when he saw the young man's panicked expression, he couldn't help but think that if there really was fluorescent moss down there, it would have to be at least the size of a football field to make the young man panic. He immediately gestured for the young man to quiet down and asked, "What's wrong?" My lord." The young man gasped for breath. Captain Carglass wants you to come and take a look yourself." Brando and Coden looked at each other. What was Carglass up to this time? However, he still nodded and gestured for the young man to lead the way. He then led the others to follow. After leaving the five-headed lizard's nest, the underground cave became narrow and slender. In the darkness they could barely see that the surrounding walls were very smooth. There were indeed traces of water washing over them. However, these traces were very old. Brando carefully observed the ground and the walls on both sides. He confirmed that there were no traces of any living creatures. At most, there were some small footprints left behind by rodents. They were not a threat at all. There were also no familiar traces at the top of the cave. For example, there were tentacle monsters, mutant bats, or strangle beasts that liked to lurk between the stalactites. They walked along the underground river for a few minutes before a ball of fire appeared in front of them. Under the light of the fire, Brando saw Carglass and 4 other young men. Since Muriel and the other half of the third group were still on the surface, Carglass had only brought half of the group with him. Of course, even so, his group was still the most outstanding among the young men. That was why Brando could rest assured that the most dangerous task would be given to them. When Brando arrived, Carglass and the others were resting by the torches. When they saw their lord, they immediately stood up and saluted. "My lord." The unruly youngest son of Lord Maxon rubbed his hands with a troubled expression. "We found something that we can't handle." "Something that we can't handle?" Brando paused and asked, "What's the situation?" "How should I put it?" Carglass's expression was extremely strange. "It's indescribable." Brando wondered what kind of thing could make this fearless young man reveal such an expression as if the sky had fallen. But he knew that Carglass was not joking with him. Otherwise, he would know the price of such a joke. Of course, he also had another absurd thought. Could it really be a fluorescent moss the size of a football field? "Anyway, my lord, please come and take a look." Carglass coughed and replied. He then stepped aside and extended his hand to lead the way for Brando. Brando nodded and followed Carglass. It seemed to be the exit of the underground tunnel. The young lord saw a light at the exit. He was stunned. Was it really fluorescent moss? But when he reached the exit, he was stunned. He opened his mouth slightly, but he couldn't make a sound. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say that he was petrified. A brilliant light shone into Brando's eyes. It was as if the light had cast a spell on him, rendering him immobile. It was a crystal mine. It was a magic crystal mine that stretched as far as the eye could see. Lord of Abyss. Brando seemed to have predicted the old knight's plan. In the week since he left for the dark forest, the whole of southern Tanajul had been peaceful. It was as if a war was about to break out. Of course, the situation in the north was not as good. Tajiv and its clans had tasted the sweetness of the plunder, so they became even more aggressive in their attacks. Even though they were ambushed by the old knight once or twice, most of the time, Lord Paulus's troops were still suffering. On the other side of Abyss, the Shire went to look for blacksmith Grandmaster Bosley. In fact, after Amandina left, the two of them were in charge of all the administrative and construction matters in the territory. Romaine, on the other hand, had nothing to do after she sorted out and reorganized the accounts. But just as Brando expected, she was abnormally obedient. Other than going to a fixed seat in the bar every day and sitting there from afternoon until sunset, she did not do anything else. According to her, this was a place Brando used to frequent, and she wanted to reserve a seat for Brando. Naturally, the others turned a blind eye to her actions. As long as she did not tear down Abyss, they would be thankful. Of course, to Bosley, even if she did tear down Abyss, it was fine as long as his workshop was fine. Today he squatted on the steps outside the workshop as usual and tried to light up his pipe. But he quickly realized that no matter how hard he tried, not a single spark landed in the pipe. There was even one that rolled around the edge of the pipe 3 times before it was extinguished. Obviously this was not a normal thing. The old man raised his head and saw Seal, who was wearing a light purple robe, standing not too far away with a smile on his face. He snorted and muttered under his breath, "Damned Magus." But he did not dare to say it out loud. He dared to contradict Brando, but wizards were mysterious creatures. Who knew if they would cast a curse on him while he was asleep? Bosley raised his head and muttered, "All right, Lord the Shire, why are you looking for this old bag of bones again? Or are you just here to toy with this pitiful old man?" "I wouldn't dare," the Shire shrugged. "I'm here to discuss something with you, Master Bosley." "What is it?" "The Lord gave me an order." "Chem?" Bosley knew that this young wizard had a special way of contacting the Lord. "I'm saying?" The Shire thought for a moment and decided to use a more tactful way to explain the situation. He did not want to scare the old man. "Master Bosley, what do you think is the possibility of us opening a path into the Black Forest?" "Opening a path?" Bosley was surprised. "I understand. You want to get some resources from the Black Forest? That's a little troublesome. The investment might not be enough to cover the costs. There's nothing good near the Black Forest, but maintaining a path like this will require a lot of investment." He thought for a moment. Tanajul might not be able to support it. "What if it's a death order?" The Shire asked again. "He's crazy." Bosley suddenly realized that the wizard in front of him was the retainer of the Lord, so he quickly changed his words. "Well, that depends on how deep he wants to go. I think a day or two shouldn't be too much of a problem." "What his lordship means is," Charles replied with a grin, "at least a week's journey." "Impossible." To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 368. Bosley almost jumped out of his seat. Even though he wasn't good at building roads, he knew that the Black Forest was a treasure trove for smithing masters like him. However, he knew exactly what kind of place the Black Forest was. "That's a little troublesome." The Shire shook his head. "What do you mean?" Bosley felt that the young adept was implying something. "My lord, he discovered a crystal mine in the Black Forest. I mean, according to what you said, it's going to be troublesome for us to claim it as ours." "Magic crystal mine." The old man jumped out of his seat. "You're telling the truth." "No, I'm talking about the crystal mine." The Shire shook his head. "According to my lord's inspection, there should be star iron and cold steel. There should be some other rare minerals as well." "Iron?" Bosley's voice trembled. "Yes, there's iron, but there's also star iron and cold steel." How big is it?" "I don't know how big it is. They spent 2 days there, but they still haven't found the edge. There's not enough time. We can only determine the size of the mine later." The Shire replied with a straight face. 2 days and they still haven't found the edge? Bosley felt like he was about to suffocate. His lord and his companions were 3 gold-ranked existences. How could they not find the edge in 2 days? However, he suddenly thought of another problem. His face paled. "Is it an open-pit mine?" "No, The Shire shook his head. It's underground. Bosley let out a sigh of relief. From your description, I thought it was an open-pit mine. But how did my lord and his companions find it? Prospecting is a specialized field of study. Weren't they traveling in the forest? No, 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 the Shire shook his head again. Let me finish. It's not easy to describe, but how should I put it? What I mean is that it's an open-pit mine. Bosley's hand loosened, and the cigarette butt that had been with him for many years fell to the ground and shattered into pieces. However, he did not mind at all. He grabbed the man's sleeve and asked loudly, not caring if the man was an adept or not, "Are you saying that there is an iron mine of unknown size in the Black Forest with magic crystals and large amounts of rare minerals waiting for us to mine?" The Shire quickly pushed his hand away and put a finger to his lips. Keep your voice down, keep your voice down. You don't want to tell Count Randner about this, do you?" the young wizard asked in a mysterious tone. Bosley was silent for a moment. He looked around cautiously, but he quickly turned back to the Shire and said, "Are you telling the truth? That's great, the White Lion armor won't be a problem at all." Wait a minute. The Shire feigned a look of confusion. "Grandmaster Bosley, that place is located in the Black Forest and it's quite far from here. According to what you just said, it will take us a long time before we can mine the ores there." Bullshit. Bosley waved his hand. His eyes were red as he gritted his teeth. "Leave this matter to me. Even if I have to sacrifice these old bones of mine, I will succeed." Martha above an open-air crystal mine. Bosley muttered to himself. "That won't do," the Shire quickly shook his head. "If anything happens to you, my lord will definitely kill me, especially if he knows that I'm the one who instigated this." Bosley glared at him. "Humph, don't worry. I won't do it alone and I can't do it. I'll ask my students to help, but it'll take some time." Bosley's determination was evident when he said those words. It seemed like the mine was extremely attractive to a grandmaster blacksmith like him. He thought for a moment, "But we can start work first. Get someone to get some magic crystals. Those things are worth more than silver. Once we have money, everything else will be easier." However, Bosley suddenly stopped and stared at the young wizard from the corner of his eyes. "Hold on, you didn't set me up from the start, did you?" The Shire suddenly understood and said with an innocent look, "Of course not. I also think that this is a good idea, but the others won't be able to do it. I think the subterranean dwellers are good, but I don't know if Tajiv will agree." Bosley looked at the young wizard suspiciously. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that this damned wizard had dug a hole for him to jump into. He suddenly remembered that he said he would ask his students to help, and the words he said to Brando made his vision go dark. However, the young wizard didn't notice the look of regret on the Grandmaster Blacksmith's face. The Shire was only thinking about how to get Tajiv to help him. Otherwise, it wouldn't be easy to complete the Lord's orders. Opening a path through the Black Forest. This was a feat that Erwin had never done in hundreds of years. When Bosley and Seal decided to open up a path in the dark forest, they sent the first batch of subterranean dwellers into the forest, but Brendel and his team did not stop exploring the dark forest. In Wone's calendar, the sleeping moon symbolized talent. Astrologers believed that babies born during this month had extraordinary potential. But in the witch's ancient prophecy, potential meant sleeping power. Sleep corresponded to awakening. From the beginning of sleep to the end of awakening, this was the meaning of the last month of the year in Vaunt. Therefore, this was a sign that wisdom and spirit would light up the fire of civilization in the darkness, and it was also the most important month of the first year. In most temples' calendars, on the last day of the sleeping moon, the 31st, people would welcome the biggest festival of the year in Wonde, the Revival Festival. This grand festival would last for 7 days, but in a bustling city like Freeport, the carnival atmosphere would last until the month of recovery, which would be 2 months later. Of course, in the dark wilderness there was no such thing. Brendel and his team finally arrived at the outskirts of the loop of trade winds at midnight. In order to remember the passing of prosperity and the year of summer leaves, Falerne, the chief logistics officer since the beginning of the adventure, gave everyone in the party a small piece of gingerbread. Even Ropar and his Fireclaw lizard men were no exception. The young people sat around the campfire and sang songs of their hometown. Their songs were not only filled with nostalgia for the past, but also a yearning for the future. The song was melodious, and the sparks from the campfire rose into the dark night sky. The hardships of the past month in the Black Forest seemed to have become a memory of the past at this moment. Everyone felt that they had become more mature. Brando sat beside the campfire and gave his gingerbread to Tia. The wild elf girl seemed to be very fond of this special dessert that could not be found in the Lopez region. She held a small piece of gingerbread in one hand, and there were biscuit crumbs at the corner of her mouth. She smiled sweetly at Brando. "Looks like Tia likes me more," Brando said to Falerne. Falerne stood behind Brando and looked at her sister without saying a word. In fact, she also gave her gingerbread to her sister. Even though she was strict, it was obvious that she cared for her sister. "Sister Falerne is too lazy to lower herself to your level." Amandina passed her gingerbread to Tia and replied with a smile. On a night like this, the noble's daughter felt a rare sense of relaxation. This was the last day of the year. Too many things had happened in this year, so much that she could not remember them all. This was the year of flowers and summer leaves. Tia was beside Amandina, and there was already a small pile of gingerbread in her dress. She looked at the gingerbread with sparkling eyes. Scarlet, who was leaning against a tree, looked at Amandina, and then looked at the gingerbread in her hand. She thought for a moment and put it in as well. "Thank you, Sister Scarlet," Tia said sweetly. The red-haired girl reached out and patted her head. Brando smiled and did not reply to Amandina's words. He did not care about Falerne's attitude either. He looked up at the night sky that was as dark as ink. He looked at the leaves that were silently hanging on the branches in the night sky, not moving at all. He looked at the sparks that rose from the campfire and flickered slightly before disappearing. The brightest star in the sky belonged to Martha. He looked at it and waited for the light of the star to reach its brightest. And so, the year of flowers and summer leaves passed. He would always remember this year and the War of the Black Roses that happened in this year. When he looked up, he seemed to see the night sky of Bucci during the 4 or 5 months of summer, and the beautiful river of stars that stretched across the sky. He could see the faces of many people, but these people's faces gradually faded and became blurry. However, there were some people whose faces became clear. Brando recognized them one by one. The young Roman, Freya, Martin, Breton, and many others. This was the year of flowers and summer leaves that belonged to him. It came into his life for the second time and left for the second time. It seemed to leave no trace, but it could not be erased. Brando then thought about the next year. The bloody war on the continent began in this year. Perhaps it could not be called the beginning of the war and chaos that would last for half a century, but no matter what, Wone began to move towards chaos from this year. The sword symbolized conquest. But it was also a weapon that made people bleed. When the sword appeared on the earth, the stars changed their paths and heroes were born. Therefore, the astrologers named this year the Year of Swords. This was the beginning of the chaotic history of Wone, and also the year when the players began to write their own epics. But Brando stared at the night sky thinking about something else. The Year of Swords. This was the year that would decide Erwin's fate. Whether history would return to glory and glory, or follow its original path into the abyss, it seemed that the time was not far away. The young lord lowered his head and looked at the loop of trade winds under the night sky. The circulation of the atmosphere formed a huge cyclone. It started from the southern foot of the Kalanga Mountains, traversed the entire peninsula, and went straight up to the clouds. At that moment, it was as if an ancient giant beast was lying in front of the group. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 369. Notice had a dream. In the dream, he was surrounded by a tide of undead creatures. In the boundless and empty wilderness, those skeletons with calcified, grayish-yellow bones and crimson flames dancing in their empty eye sockets pounced on him wave after wave from the darkness. In the dream, his comrades fell one after another. The battlefield was filled with arrows. He looked around and saw corpses everywhere. Erwin's broken war flag drooped down in exhaustion and remained motionless. Until the last moment, the world seemed to have fallen on him. Then he woke up with a start from the dream and sat up on the bed covered with soft reeds. The dark forest was still chilly in the early morning, but when Notice touched his back, he found that it was drenched in sweat and his pale forehead was covered with fine beads of sweat. Panting, he sat on the bed for a while before he came back to his senses. He looked up and saw a ray of morning light flowing into the small room from the windowsill. The window was actually a hole dug out of a tree trunk. The furnishings in the room were simple. Most of them were made of wood, and the whole room was a hole dug out of a tree trunk. Some vines hung down from above, forming a natural and simple space. Notice held his forehead and remembered that he was no longer on the battlefield. It had been a few months since he was rescued by those strange people and sent here, but he still had nightmares like this. He took a deep breath and stood up. He was a little shaky. Then he suddenly heard a noise outside the window. He could not help but feel strange. This village had always been quiet. Did something happen? Or did the revival ceremony begin? Notice came to the window and looked out in confusion. The settlement built by the Druids at the periphery of the loop of trade winds was a town called the Green Tower. It was called a town, but there were thousands of people living there. There were also many centaurs, tree elves, and some Tanians. The Druids had lived a mixed life with other races in the dark forest for a long time. They built many villages in the forest. They planted a kind of fast-growing ancient tree and lived in the trunks of these magical trees. The villages were built about 20 to 30 meters above the ground from these towering trees. The whole town was connected by suspension bridges. The suspension bridges were formed by intertwining magical vines with wooden planks in the middle. They were even sturdier than the strongest stone bridge. Countless suspension bridges shuttled between the ancient trees, forming a strange landscape of the city in midair. The Druids worked at sunrise and rested at sunset, but the centaurs had an opposite schedule. They liked the brightly lit market and even installed lights on the suspension bridges. They were a kind of lily of the valley with huge buds like lanterns that could shine in the night. But more of them were thick vines that spiraling upward. They led to the upper level of the town where the Druids gathered and the nest of the giant eagles. The Druids and the giant eagles had been allies for hundreds of years. Brendel followed the great Druid Grey Crow and the others as they slowly climbed up the lush green vines. There were huge birds of prey with huge wingspans flying up and down between the gigantic tree trunks. The huge canopy was like a layer of clouds, allowing them to shuttle between the green clouds. Of course, Brendel also saw the centaur guards patrolling the area. They wore shiny armor and wore a stern-looking sentry's helmet. The centaurs and druids had a long history of living together. They were a race of warriors, and their individual strength was even stronger than the subterranean dwellers. But in the dark forest they also relied on the druids to survive. Apart from them, there were also a large number of tree elves, Tanians, and bear monsters in the town. There were also Pegasi and unicorns. Anyone who worshipped the goddess of the forest, Naya, was a guest of the druids. However, the druids weren't in charge of the daily operations of the town. In fact, the Green Tower's defense was in the hands of a centaur leader called Xania. The daily operations were managed by an administrative council made up of tree elves, Tanians, and bear monsters. The druids lived in the upper level of the druid district. They had their own independent organization called the Deadwood Council, which dealt with the internal affairs of the druids. Of course, their main task was to monitor the loop of trade winds and any changes in the dark forest. The upper level of the druid district was much simpler than the lower level of the town. The druids used thick vines to form a square between 6 ring-shaped ancient trees. In the center of the square was the holy statue of goddess Naya. The hollow branches of the 6 ancient trees formed 6 halls, and the hall in the west was where the Deadwood Council was located. 2 ancient tree elves were squatting at the entrance of the hall. They were about 3 stories tall, and they were dozing off with their palms supporting their upper bodies. These tree elves seemed to be the guards of the hall, but they didn't fulfill their responsibilities. When Brando and the others approached them, the tree elven on the left opened one of its eyes. It glanced at Big Druid Grey Crow and slowly closed it again. The other tree elven was snoring, its voice sounding like a song from an ancient forest. "Please follow me." Big Druid Grey Crow gestured to the 2 tree elves and turned to the others. Brando nodded and followed him into the hall. The youths under him were left in the town, and the friendly tree elves were there to receive them. Coden and Ropar were with them to prevent them from causing trouble. At this moment, only Scarlet and Amandina followed behind the young lord. They had never seen such a place before, and their eyes were filled with curiosity. Even the noble ladies who were more reserved could not help but look around. The hall was no different from the usual architectural style of the druids. It was simple and natural, and there were no extravagant decorations other than the statues of the ancient druids and spirit beasts. The walls of the hall were hollowed out, and only a few pillars were left, making the hall look like it was exposed to the wind. Of course, the vitality of the ancient magic trees was very strong, but even so, it did not affect their growth. From here on out, the ancient tree was still lush with leaves. Brando saw a circle of people standing in the hall. The druid elder he met the first time was among them, and there were a few other elders. There were a total of 17 people. Brando sensed that there were only 2 of them who had the same aura as Big Druid Grey Crow. This meant that the 3 great druids of the Green Tower were gathered here. They really think highly of me. Brando could not help but think. Suddenly, he saw a small figure rushing out from the side of the room, her long green hair fluttering in the wind as she threw herself into his arms. "Brother Brando!" Sifrid cried out happily as she buried her head in Brando's embrace. As the chosen one of the forest goddess, she knew that Brando had left the Abyss for this place. She had been waiting for this day for more than a month, and this day had finally come. Brando was stunned for a moment before he recognized the little girl. Sifrid had grown a little taller in the past half a year, and her complexion had also become a lot rosier. It seemed that the druids had taken good care of her. But he did not know that there was a misunderstanding. The druids did not know how to take care of people, and Sifrid's daily life had been taken care of by the tree elves. Since they were entrusted by the great druids, the tree elves did not dare to be negligent. Brando stroked Sifrid's head and looked up at the druid elders. "I like people who keep their promises. I'm very satisfied that you did not lie to me." Sifrid seemed to understand that Brando was about to get to the point. She tilted her head in response to Brando's hand and obediently stood to the side. Amandina squatted down and held the little girl's hand with a smile. Sifrid responded with a sweet smile in return. "My lord." The oldest great druid standing in the middle of the 17 druid elders spoke up. He was leaning on a walking stick and had a long cloak of leaves draped over his shoulders. His eyebrows and beard were completely white, and his face was filled with wrinkles, but his eyes were sharp and spirited. But before he could speak, Brando politely interrupted him. "Great elder," he said, "I am a noble of the Erwin kingdom, but my identity is meaningless outside of the human world. You don't have to address me as such. You are the elder here and I am the younger one. You can just call me Brando." The great elder was slightly taken aback, but his expression softened as he nodded. Then he looked at Andelu and asked him to speak to Brando. "My lord, let me speak." Brando knew that this was the great elder's way of repaying his respect. He nodded and did not object. "What the great elder wants to ask is, my lord, you said that you understand the ancient druid magic and even the secrets of the Black Forest. He wants to know how much of that is true. These druids really don't know how to interact with people. Why would a guest come from afar and not let them rest first, and directly come over to discuss business?" Brendel thought in his heart. The impression that he gave others was a little too cold and unreasonable. But he liked this style. If he had to stay here for 3 days and slowly discuss the important matters after the banquet, he would not be able to enter the loop of trade winds for at least half a month. He did not have that much time to squander. He thought for a moment and replied, "I only know a little about ancient magic, but it doesn't mean that I understand it, let alone that I'm good at it. As for the Black Forest at the border of Tanajul, I do know some inside information. For example, you said that the ruins in the forest are Valhalla. Is this true?" A tall druid asked. "No." Brando looked at him and confirmed that he was a druid of the Beast Spirit Circle. "I only said that Valhalla is in the loop of trade winds. As for whether it is the ruins or not, I can only say that the location of the ruins is very close." The great elder nodded. Brando did not like to boast, but he also did not jump to conclusions easily. This made the great elder feel that he was somewhat trustworthy. But he did not reply, and the other druids only looked at each other. Chapter 370. The first elder didn't say anything, but he was thinking about it in his heart. The name Valhalla came from an ancient legend. It was said that there was a fantasy kingdom in the loop of trade winds, the resting place of the brave warriors. One of the most primitive fire seeds in the world of Wand was stored there. As long as the fire seed was ignited, the order of the Kalanga Peninsula would be restored. It was possible that a vast land as vast as the Cruz Empire would be formed. The druids of the Deadwood Council had been guarding this secret for generations. This was also why they wanted to enter the loop of trade winds to find out the truth behind this strange atmospheric circulation phenomenon. However, Valhalla was just like a legend. It was there but also not there. Countless druids passed through the loop of trade winds and entered the Kalanga Mountains, but they found nothing. The only thing they found was the ruins near the center of the loop of trade winds. However, the great elder knew that Andrew and the others had only found the outer area of the ruins. The center of the loop of trade winds was the center of the loop of trade winds, and no one could pass through it. "Mr. Brendel, I'm sure Elder Greycrow has told you about the recent changes in the loop of trade winds?" Greycrow looked up at Brendel and asked, "I'm sure Elder Greycrow has told you about it before coming here?" Brando nodded. The changes in the loop of trade winds were caused by the ebb and flow of the mana tide, so it was not something that happened recently. Actually, he did not tell us the truth. We're in a much bigger trouble than that. the Great Elder said slowly. Brando did not say anything. He looked at the 17 Druid elders. Including Grey Raven, there were 18 of them. They should be all the elders of the Loop of the Sky in this area, including the 3 great druids. He suddenly understood why they were gathered here. The druids were in trouble, and it sounded like it was not a small problem. Otherwise they would not have come to him. However, he did not take the opportunity to ask for an exorbitant price. Instead, he nodded silently. The Great Elder seemed to be satisfied with Brando's attitude. The young man's humility made the Great Elder believe that he was a human he could interact with. The loop of trade winds. He quoted, "This atmospheric circulation starts at the eastern end of the Karana Peninsula and surrounds the Karana Mountains. It is the most spectacular natural phenomenon in the southern part of Wonde. On a clear day, even in Tanajul and Vlada, you can see this white wall of clouds running from east to west, hanging upside down in the southern sky of Erewhon." The geography of Lantan Island, the work of Master Tulman, Brando said, slightly surprised. He thought that these druids really didn't care about worldly affairs, but it seemed that they still had some contact with the civilized world, just not known to the world. The Great Elder nodded. The Ring of Skies is a loose organization. The druids have their own tasks and have been monitoring the movements of the Black Forest for a long time. And we, the Deadwood Council, have been guarding the secrets of the Loop of Trade Winds for generations. The Great Elder turned his head and looked through the canopy at the white wall of clouds in the south. The thick layer of clouds was tens of thousands of meters high and stretched endlessly from east to west. Some birds were flying in the sky with the cloud wall as the background, but they were so small that they looked like a few black dots. The Black Forest south of Tanajul has always been called the wilderness closest to civilization in the Ring of Skies. It is the most stable Black Forest around the world of Wonde. Not to mention that the border of Tanajul is rarely attacked by monsters. Even the areas deep in the forest border are rarely seen. Brando listened to the Great Elder's description and nodded in agreement. The Great Elder was telling the truth. The Black Forest at the border of Tanajul was indeed known for its gentleness. Otherwise, the players of Erewhon would not have ventured into the Black Forest from here for the first time. And they would not have been able to complete the magnificent feat of going deep into the Kalanga Mountains so early. The reason is because of the Loop of Trade Winds, right? The young lord asked. Not only was the Grand Elder shocked by his words, but the other 17 Druid elders, including Grey Crow, couldn't help but look at him in disbelief. How do you know? This time we have been in the Black Forest for a month. We have encountered thunderstorms twice and snowfall once. 11 days have been sunny and windy. 3 days have been scorching hot like summer. The rest of the days have been cloudy. Brando ignored their surprise and continued to speak. There have been a week when the day was less than 6 hours and 1 day when there was no night. This is the Black Forest. The deeper you go into the forest, the more obvious the changes will be, and the more abnormal the phenomena will be. But in this ever-changing wilderness, there is a huge atmospheric circulation that has never changed. The trade winds arrive at the Kalanga Peninsula every year, accompanied by abundant rain. Does this mean that there is a hidden order? He looked at the Great Elder. Clang. The Great Elder's cane fell to the ground, but he did not bend down to pick it up. Instead, he looked at Brando with a complicated expression. You do know this place very well. Yes, it is as you have guessed. The Great Elder paused for a moment before continuing Brando's words. We have discovered that the Loop of Trade Winds has stabilized the order of this region more than 100 years ago. But recently this situation has changed. What happened? Brando asked. Something strange has happened in the Loop of Trade Winds, Mr. Brando. The area that we could enter easily in the past has become dangerous. The forest is full of dangers, and the ancient trees no longer provide us with guidance. In there. The Great Elder seemed to be searching for a suitable description. It is like being shrouded in a thick layer of fog. Nothing can be seen or heard. Is that all? No. Since a few weeks ago, those who entered the forest were attacked. Some were injured, but fortunately no one died. Brando asked after hearing the Great Elder's explanation. So you are worried that this is a sign. The power of the Loop of Trade Winds is gradually weakening, and it could be destroyed in an instant. Once the Loop of Trade Winds collapses, the factor that stabilizes the Karana Peninsula will no longer exist. The violent mana brought by the Great Tide will corrode this region, and even Trentheim will be affected. The original guarded land will be reduced to nothing? Brando's words hit the nail on the head. The Great Elder nodded with a heavy expression. Their worries were not unfounded. The Kingdom of Erewhon did not have the strength to defend the south, and once the Kalanga Peninsula was destroyed, Tanajal and even the entire Ranner region would fall back into the wilderness. Your guess is correct. There is such a possibility. Brando thought for a moment and replied, but this problem is not unsolvable. There is a way. Andrew blurted out. The elders had discussed this matter for half a month without any results. How did this young man solve the problem with just a few words? He could not help but look at Brendel, wondering if he was just boasting. I am also curious, Brando replied. Since you know about the Great Tide, how can you not know about the connection between the two? You mean? The Great Elder was shocked. The weakening of the loop of trade winds is caused by the Great Tide? Isn't it obvious that the enemy is strong and we are weak? But wait, Mr. Brando. The previous Great Tides only happened within the past 100 years. The magic moon did not have such a strong influence. The Great Elder exclaimed in shock. Brando slapped his forehead and suddenly realized where the problem was. You don't know about the Millennium Tide? What is that? The Great Tide that occurs once every 1,000 years. The last Great Tide ended the Year of Chaos, and this Great Tide is coming soon. The loop of trade winds is obviously affected by the Great Tide, Brando replied. The Druids no longer doubted that the young lord was boasting. Their expressions changed. I remember now, Andrew suddenly said. My lord, when we were in Abes, you told me that this era is coming to an end and the magic moon is coming. The last Great Tide ended the Year of Chaos, and no one knows what will happen this time. Under such circumstances, it is impossible for you to suppress the growth of the dark forest. The burly Druid elder cried out in annoyance. Damn it. I didn't notice it at that time. I thought you were just talking about the normal Great Tide of the magic moon. Brando looked at the dozen Druid elders strangely. But didn't you ask for the opinions of the other members of the Loop of the Sky? I remember that although your organization is scattered, you still have a headquarters in the sacred land. Isn't there a lot of documents from before the Great Tide? Don't tell me that no one knows about the Great Tide? That's right, the Great Elder replied. He was not surprised that Brando knew about the secrets of the Druids. He guessed that the young man had some kind of relationship with the Druids. Otherwise, how could he know so much about them? We Druids rely on the wind of trade winds to transmit information. It takes at least one season for us to go back and forth. But the next season is spring, the season of the goddess. By the time we receive a reply, it will be summer. I see. Brando nodded. All right, he said, let's get back to the topic. Let's see how we can solve this problem. If we have to wait until summer, I'm afraid I can't wait that long. Then, my lord, do you have any ideas? The Great Elder changed the way he addressed Brendel. Nothing, Brando replied. We can only deal with the changes by sticking to the status quo. You mean? Valhalla. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 371. When the tree elves saw the pale-faced human open the door and walk out, they couldn't help but greet him warmly and curiously. Hello, Nozadar. The weather is good today. Let's go out for a walk. Their chatter made Nozadar feel a little dizzy. If it was before, he would have been overjoyed to have so many beautiful elven girls talking and laughing around him. But now he only felt that everything was unfamiliar. The sunlight that shone through the shade of the trees was unusually dazzling. The young man couldn't help but raise his hand to block the dazzling light. He had been cooped up in the house for a long time and couldn't adapt to the outside world. What's wrong? Are you not feeling well? The elven girl asked with concern. No. He shook his head and forced a smile. Then he looked down at the residential area. The tree elves had arranged for him to live in the northeast area of the residential area between 3 tall trees. The scenery here was very good. The elves had built a platform to form a courtyard. Other than his room, there were a few other elven families living on the platform. Everyone treated him warmly. But Nozadar felt a sense of alienation. He felt that he didn't belong here. What's wrong? He looked down at the residential area and asked, why is it so noisy? I heard that many people from the outside world have come, an elf replied. People from the outside world? Just like you, human. Not only that, there are also lizard men. They started chattering again. Why don't we go take a look together, Nozadar? Someone suggested. The young man was a little tempted. But at that moment an elven guard came up from below. She was slightly surprised when she saw the young man and asked in a pleasant voice, Nozadar, you've come out? Lady Claire. The young man recognized the elven guard. She was the one who led him to this courtyard that day. I heard that people from the outside world have come in? Yes, there are quite a few, the elven guard replied. What? Do you still want to go out? But normally no one would go too far from the Green Tower. The druid elders would occasionally go to the outside world, but they wouldn't bring you along. She suddenly understood. I understand. You want to see if those people are your companions, right? Nozadar nodded. I heard that it's a lord, a human lord. Lord? Nosida asked curiously, why would a lord of the human world come here? I thought the druids didn't want to interact with them? I don't know. Claire shook her head. But they seem to be guests of the elders. There are people from several countries. They seem to be from Cruz and Buga. Oh yes, there are also people from Erwin. Erwin? Nosida's eyes widened in shock. He suddenly became excited. Claire, can you do me a favor? I know. You want me to take you to them, don't you? The young man smiled awkwardly. What's so good about the outside world? The elven guard shook his head and sighed. All right, come with me. Nosida, are you leaving? Someone asked. The young man thought of his wife who might still be waiting for him to return and nodded. At the same time, Brando's discussion with the druid elders had just come to an end. The young lord told the great elder that the most direct way to solve the problem of the loop of trade winds was to find the primordial fire seed that was said to be preserved in Valhalla. According to the legends, once the fire seed was ignited, the Black Forest would gradually become a protected land, and all problems would be easily solved. But I'll have to wait for 3 days before I can confirm what I'm going to do. According to the great elder's description, he suspected that the creature that attacked the druids in the loop of trade winds was a rare magical creature. He had fought with that thing before. Although it was only a few times, he still remembered the strange way it attacked. As he was thinking, he suddenly heard Amandina sigh beside him. So beautiful. Brando turned around and saw the noble's daughter looking at an elf playing a flute on a suspension bridge not far away. The melody was melodious and beautiful, and it was captivating. But he did not know if she was talking about the melody or the place. The Green Tower was known for its beautiful scenery in the Amber Sword. With a magnificent wall of clouds as the background, the town was built in midair and connected by suspension bridges made of vines. The whole place was filled with a sense of fantasy. Ever since he left the Withering Tree Council, Brando had promised Amandina to tour this strange town with him. Amandina seemed to be in high spirits today, and it was rare for her to be so happy. The three of them arrived at a market called Centaur's Hoof. The market was suspended in midair and was made of wood. It was divided into 3 levels. The 4 corners of the market were connected by suspension bridges made of vines, but the market itself was suspended in the air by magic. There were many tree elves here, but most of the residents were centaurs. The market sold all kinds of goods such as grains, fabrics, strange plants, fruits, magical materials, strange ores and magical items. The dark forest was rich in natural resources, so the market was filled with all kinds of strange goods. However, the trade here was still at the stage of bartering, and was not limited to gold and silver. This was because gold and silver were only used as magical materials in the dark forest. Brando, Amandina, Sifrid, and Scarlet first went to the 3rd level of the market to watch a free gladiator fight. The centaurs had bad tempers and often fought with each other, but there was a special place for them to vent their frustrations. In fact, the tree elves would occasionally meet up for an archery competition, but it was clear that they did not have the chance to enjoy it today. After that, they went to a bar opened by the tree elves and tasted a special flower nectar. It tasted like fruit wine, but it had a strong aftertaste. Brando quickly realized that he had made a mistake because Amandina and Scarlet were not players. They only took a small sip and their faces flushed red. Brendel hurriedly stopped the 2 ladies, lest they fall head first into the bar because of the alcohol. That would be a big joke. But Amandina was clearly not done yet. She had heard from the owner of the bar that there was a specialty of the Green Tower, tree gems. These gems looked like emeralds, but they were more crystalline and translucent. What's more, they were not expensive either. Amandina was tempted. She acted coquettishly under the influence of alcohol and pestered Brando to bring them to have a look. Brando looked at Amandina's flushed face and shook his head. He did not expect this calm and rational lady to have such poor alcohol tolerance. However, Scarlet's face was also red from drinking too much, and she seemed to be moved by Amandina's suggestion. Brando knew that he could not refuse. But he came to a conclusion. Women seemed to have no resistance to shiny things. This was similar to the habits of the Dragon clan. Fortunately, Brendel had the foresight to take out some magic crystals from the five-headed basilisk's nest. These things were hard currency in this place. If it was an ornament made of tree gems, a lesser moon crystal could be exchanged for a bunch of them. Thus, when Brando placed a small piece of blazing agate in front of the centaur shop owner, the centaur merchant who had been doing business here for many years knew that he had a big customer. However, there was no way that he could earn much from selling the tree gems. The centaur merchant promoted the ornaments that he had personally crafted while trying to find out if the young lord needed any mysterious magical items. Brando was a little amused. He knew about this kind of magic shop. It was a place where you could buy a lot of cheap magic materials, but it was a little rare to see a finished product. It might be able to fool a new player who came here for the first time, but for a veteran like him, it was a little disdainful. Brando, let him take it out for me to have a look. Amandina's face was red as she squinted her eyes and whispered, see if it's as good as yours, my lord. Brando suddenly felt that this noble lady was quite cute. He nodded, take it out for me to have a look. The centaur merchant's face lit up with joy. If he could sell one or two accessories, he would not have to do business for the rest of the month. He mysteriously took out a pair of rings and said to Brando, sir, I bought these rings from a witch. Legend has it that they have the power of love. As long as your two female companions wear them, they will fall in love with you forever. What kind of nonsense is that? Amandina covered Sifrid's ears and said to the centaur merchant, take it back, my lord won't buy such despicable things. Brando shook his head with a smile. If two enchanted rings were called rings with the power of love, then wouldn't the ring of the Wind Empress be a divine artifact blessed by the Wind God? But he suddenly remembered that the ring of the Wind Empress on his hand was the real deal. It was a divine artifact blessed by the Wind God, even if it was just a fragment. He coughed and shook his head. If that's all you have, then I think we should just buy some gems. Don't, the centaur merchant immediately stopped them. I have something else that my lord will like. Brando was surprised. You know that we came from the outside world? The centaur merchant smiled mysteriously. I'm not afraid of being laughed at by my lord. I've been doing business here for decades and I know most of the people in the Green Tower. So that's how it is, Brendel replied. Then your business is really difficult. The centaur merchant's face immediately turned awkward. He realized that his little trick had been seen through, and he could only smile. Don't worry, my lord, this time it's definitely not that kind of thing. I bought this from a witch. She came from the outside world just like you. The centaur merchant took out a box and opened it. Then he opened the box and there was a shield-shaped stone piece inside. Brando's heart skipped a beat when he saw it. The stone key. P.S. Wrong name. Equals smiley face. Chapter 372. The Stone Key. Legend has it that it was used to open the portal between the elemental plane and the world of Wond. In the Amber Sword, its other function was to open an item to build a city in the wilderness. This thing and the Fire Seed were twins. The Fire Seed represented the rules of order, and the Stone Key was built on the basis of the elements. This was the law established by Lady Martha at the beginning of the world, using the law to restrain magic and building the world with the elements. This thing was worth a lot in the game, and what was even rarer was that it was priceless. This was because most of the high-level quests that involved the elemental plane required it as a core item. For example, Brando had the quest to upgrade Howran Gaia. When the young man saw the shield-shaped stone in the box, the corner of his eyes could not help but twitch. There was only one voice that repeatedly echoed in his heart. Wear out iron shoes in vain only to find it by chance. Little guy, you're in luck. Orthla seemed to have felt Brando's emotional fluctuations and woke up from her deep sleep. Brando nodded, but his expression did not change. He asked, what is this? This is the stone key. The centaur boss replied, legend has it that it can be used to open a passage that connects our world to another world. Brando pretended to be impatient and interrupted him. A passage to another world? What's in that world? The centaur boss was speechless. He had only heard this story from the witch who had received the goods. That wicked old woman had even taken away the best tree gem in his hands. I heard that it's an elemental plane, right? He replied, choosing his words carefully. Elemental plane? Brando was puzzled. His expression was innocent. What am I going to do there? Little guy, Orthlis could not help but shake her head in his heart. You're just as good at pretending as Eloranta. If she saw you, she would definitely like you. Elanta, great sage? Brando asked in his mind. Well, Orthlis coughed softly. Gretel, Fanzin, Lord Sanorso, and Elanta. Elanta is the oldest. When they were young she was the one who dealt with the employers and merchants. Isn't that the commander? More or less. While Brando and Orthlis were talking, the centaur owner was caught in a dilemma. It seemed like Brando was not as interested in this thing as the two rings, which made him a little depressed. Sir, the witch told me that this thing is very beneficial to elementalists. Brando thought to himself that this was the truth. Using the stone key to open an earth elemental channel would allow an elementalist's earth elemental pool to expand by 100 times within 20 seconds. During this time he could cast 20 to 30 earth elemental spells at the same time, and the earth elemental channel could perfectly support it. An elementalist in that state would be like a superhuman as long as they had mana support. However, to use a core item worth tens of millions of Tor as a one-time consumable item, Brando wondered how rich he was. At least, he had never seen someone like that before. But when he looked at the centaur owner, he felt that at least this sentence was domineering enough. He laughed in his heart and pretended to be a little tempted. Is that so? How much is this thing worth? The centaur owner was considering whether to ask for the flame agate in Brando's hand, but the price of a flame agate was almost enough to buy half of his shop. He was worried that if he asked for such a price, the other party would turn around and leave. But just as he was hesitating, a hand suddenly reached out from the side and grabbed the stone key. "Boss, I want this thing." The owner of the voice threw a piece of flame agate and said softly. But how could Brando let the duck in his hand fly away? Just as the owner of the voice's hand touched the shield-shaped stone slab, a bolt of lightning shot out from Brando's hand and knocked the stone slab out of the box. Then he stretched his right hand forward, trying to grab the stone key that was in mid-air. However, the owner of the voice was obviously not an easy person to deal with. "Damn it, elementalist." The owner of the voice snorted softly. Suddenly he drew his sword and beat the stone key away. The stone key flew into the centaur shop and hit the wooden shelf, then bounced back to the two of them. The owner of the voice immediately tried to snatch it back, but before she could do anything, the stone key suddenly stopped in midair and was lifted up by a whirlwind as if it had hit a ball of cotton. It flew towards Brando. Windbind, dual elementalist. The owner of the voice stamped her foot and gave up on the idea of directly snatching the stone key. She simply stabbed her sword towards Brando. But Brando was not alarmed when he saw that the owner of the voice had turned to attack him. Because before the owner of the voice could make a move, vines suddenly sprouted from all directions and tightly wrapped around her. This was the druid's barrier spell. With a clang, the young lady's sword fell to the ground. It hurts." She squinted her eyes. Brando finally had the time to size up the opponent who came out of nowhere. He was slightly startled because the opponent was neither a Tanian nor a tree elf. She was a Cruz citizen through and through. Just by looking at the other party's long blonde hair and emerald green eyes, such obvious characteristics allowed the young lord to distinguish that the other party was definitely a noble of the Kurlutz Empire, a pure-blooded descendant of the Flame King's first batch of followers, a descendant of the Eagle Knights. But this young lady was wearing a white princess dress and long black leather boots. Her long wavy hair was tied into two unusually gorgeous ponytails on both sides of her head. She was dancing under the vines while glaring hatefully at him. There was only one word left in Brando's mind. Blonde twin ponytails. But to dare to make a move in the territory of the Druids, she had guts. You shameless." The girl's eyebrows were raised to a sharp degree. She glared at Brando. "How can you snatch something from a lady's hands?" "Wait," Brando hurriedly interrupted her. "When did this thing become yours?" I clearly paid for it." The girl choked but immediately said righteously, "Hurry up and give it back to me, hateful country bumpkin." Brando glanced at the agate and replied, "Miss, you paid for it, but did the boss take it? Buying by force is the same as selling by force. It's not a very noble act." "You." The girl was so angry that her chest heaved up and down. But now that her hands and feet were tied, she couldn't fight back even if she wanted to. Besides, her companions didn't come up. She couldn't help but turn her head, but her emerald eyes immediately lit up. "Fina, what's wrong?" The first to come up was a black-haired youth. He was wearing a black trench coat unique to Cruz's Royal Alchemists. Brando was stunned when he saw him. The Cruz Royal Alchemists required level 10 alchemists to be qualified to join. How old was this guy? No matter how Brando looked at him, he didn't look more than 15 years old. Even a genius shouldn't be like this, right? But what he didn't expect was that after the youth checked the condition of his companions, he immediately raised his head and said, "You hurt my companions, I want to duel with you." Then the youth looked up at the ancient tree above and said loudly, "Spirits above, I promise not to harm this gentleman's life. I only want to teach him a lesson. This is a dispute between us, I hope no one will interfere." Just as he finished speaking, a green light flashed in the canopy. The agreement is established. When Brendel saw the light, he knew that the barrier of peace that the druids had set up had been removed. He sighed in his heart. He actually met an experienced druid. And more importantly, this veteran was still a child. But before Brando could answer, Scarlet put down her lightning spear and blocked his way. The red-haired girl with a long ponytail coldly stared at the two people opposite her. "My lord, let me take your place." "Mountain people?" The youth was slightly surprised when he saw her red hair. "You're not locals?" "They're Erwin's people." The noble girl called Faina scoffed. "A bunch of hateful country bumpkins." She struggled a little and tried to get the vines to loosen their grip, but the more she struggled, the tighter the vines became. "Get hurt?" "Faina, don't move, it's useless. It'll be fine in a while." The young man glanced at his companion and couldn't help but sigh. It seemed that the young lady's impulsiveness had put him in a difficult position. This is the effect of the druid's peace barrier. "Who told you to be so impulsive?" "Damn it, it's all these country bumpkins' fault." The noble girl said with tears in her eyes. "Rono, help me teach them a lesson. Let them know that the dignity of the Cruz Empire is inviolable." Amandina could not help but furrow her brows when she heard this. Brando heard the two of them calling them country bumpkins again and again. No matter how good his manners were, he could not help but feel a little annoyed. Besides, he did not like the Cruz Empire to begin with, and when he heard the last sentence, he could not help but raise an eyebrow. "Well said." The young lord smiled coldly. "Well said, the dignity of the Cruz Empire is inviolable." The youth raised his head again and looked at Scarlet, who was standing in front of Brando, and said with disdain, "A man who wants a woman to stand in front of him has no right to say such things to me." Brando felt the tendons on his scalp twitching. He said to the red-haired girl, "Scarlet, this time you move aside. Let me see how invincible the Cruz Empire is." He raised his head and saw more people dressed as knights rushing over. They were all from the Cruz Empire. Strange, why are they here? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 373. The night was still far away. But the black-haired boy had already thrown 2 bottles at him. Alchemy bombs? Brando frowned and took a step back. Although it was said that the bombs were harmless, they were merciless. If the bombs were thrown at an ordinary person, they would either be dead or crippled. The bottle exploded in midair, and the boiling acid and glass shards scattered in all directions. But before they could touch his body, they were blocked by a bright and dark red shield-shaped flame shield that appeared in front of him. The Crimson Blessing spell automatically took effect. However, when the white smoke dispersed, Brando found that there were 2 strange humanoid creatures in front of him. They looked like meat golems. Their twisted and ugly bodies were covered with alchemy circles. They looked like a pile of flabby meat. But when he looked at them carefully, they were much weaker than meat golems and only slightly taller than an adult. They were called mutants. They were a kind of level 25 alchemy life. Although they were living beings, they did not have feelings, emotions, or intelligence. It was not against the teachings of the Holy Cathedral. At the same time, 12 spherical metal objects appeared behind the black-haired boy. They were magic conductors. Brando instantly understood the boy's plan. He used the alchemy life to buy time and the magic conductors to set up the alchemy circles. It seemed that the boy was preparing for a more advanced alchemy spell. He has a lot of combat experience. Brando was a little surprised. Is he from the special department? He knew that there was a special team in the Royal Alchemy Association of Cruz. The members of this team were not only experienced alchemists, but also fighters who were good at combat. They had a blood-red eagle as their emblem and were known as the War Alchemists. The War Alchemists were a combat class of alchemists. But Brando did not expect to meet them here. And the boy was too young. But Brando shook his head. Is that all you've got? The young lord from Aween did not even need to draw his sword. He stood on the spot and pressed his right hand forward. The white raven sword art immediately produced a gust of wind that collided with the 2 mutants. The power of a gold-ranked ranker was terrifying, and the 2 mutants did not even have the chance to resist. They were sent flying backwards. The noble lady who was trapped screamed and lowered her head. One of the mutants almost brushed her golden hair as it flew past. The knights in the distance also reacted quickly. They moved to the sides, allowing the two mutants to hit the ground and bounce up. Then, they crashed into the fence in that direction and fell down 100 meters. The crew's empire doesn't seem to be that good? Brando reached out his hand and asked. The wind pressure continued to advance and the youth was shocked. He did not expect this Aween man to not be as easy to deal with as he thought. The two iron-ranked beasts did not even manage to stop him for a moment. In his previous battles, no matter how strong his opponents were, they would always be delayed by these two mutant beasts. Tyre's wall. The boy gritted his teeth and shouted. The metal Magitech immediately formed a ring around him. 12 transparent shields blocked the whirlwind created by Brando. Tyre was a famous magus. He was known for his expertise in defensive spells. He had invented many famous defensive spells and defensive magic devices. After blocking Brando's attack, the black-haired boy took a deep breath and prepared to counterattack. But at this moment, a large, sturdy hand pressed down on his shoulder. The knight had arrived. Rono, you're no match for him. Step back and use your alchemy to support us. Leave this guy to us. The knight who stopped the black-haired youth was clad in full armor and wore a full helmet with purple and green feathers. He spoke in a low, muffled voice, and Brendel could tell that he was a centurion just by looking at his attire. Captain? The black-haired boy was shocked. He thought that the knight was just a second-rate elementalist. He did not expect Vahina to be so difficult to deal with. Leave it to us. Where's Master Cullens? He'll be here soon. The captain of the knight turned to look at Brando, his green eyes full of caution. Sir, is the crew's empire only SOSO? You talk big. Then I'll show you, Erwin. He swung his sword and more than 20 knights swarmed in from both sides. At the same time, the spherical Magitech spread out with the black-haired boy in the center. 12 light beams shot down and began to draw a secret circle on the ground. Every time the light beam drew a node, the boy would throw a secondary moon crystal into the small circle at the center of the node. The circle he created was divided into 3 layers, with 22 nodes forming a 3-dimensional cone-shaped synthesis formula. The speed at which the magic conductor was constructed was astonishing, and it was not inferior to the blood refinement. But the magic conductor was expensive, and only a few people were able to make it. Not everyone could afford to use it, and the advanced magic conductor required extremely high-quality amber ores to operate. Brendel could not help but think that perhaps only a rich empire like Kurlutz could afford to let its alchemists use such a luxury. But the so-called pride of mankind, the Eagle Empire, Cruz? Brando sneered in his heart. The tragic end of the Princess Regent in the Amber Sword was definitely related to this so-called glorious empire. Duke Arek could not give an answer as to where the assassins came from, but the players were everywhere. How could they hide from him? He thought to himself. I haven't even gone looking for trouble with these guys, and they've already come knocking on my door. Fine, I'll let these arrogant bastards know that Wond is not centered around Cruz. It's just a country favored by the Holy Cathedral of Fire. He glanced at the young man and recognized that he was about to draw the magic circle of storm mist. This kind of alchemy potion greatly amplified the strength of melee fighters, so he naturally could not let him finish. Although the speed of the formation of the Magitech's formation was enough to make the average alchemist feel ashamed, it was not worth mentioning in Brando's eyes. The young lord stretched out his right hand and held a flame-patterned agate between his metal fingers. The flame-patterned agate contained more than 10 times more mana than the lesser moon crystal, and it was best used to make an embryo. Brando's mind moved, and the power of the advanced alchemy circle drawn by Bahamut immediately penetrated the magic crystal, causing it to shatter. Not far away, the centaur boss who was frightened by the sudden change saw the scene with his own eyes, but he could not help but cry out in pain. That was a flame-patterned agate. Mana gushed out from the broken magic crystal. The pure mana in the crystal was not contaminated by chaos, so it had a beautiful sky-blue color. It was like a mist that surrounded Brando's hand. However, in the next moment, 3 horizontal magic circles ran through Brando's gauntlet, binding the mana inwards. The magic circles compressed forward, and together with the mana, they formed a sphere in Brando's palm. The blue mana pulsed slightly in the sphere, as if it was nurturing something to break out of its cocoon. Brando held the sphere in his hand and shot a dazzling blue light forward, passing through the 3 knight and shooting into the magic circle of the black-haired young man. The latter's expression changed drastically, and he could only watch as the magic circle that he had built turned into ashes in an instant. Counter-alchemy. His opponent was also an alchemist. And a battle-type alchemist. But what shocked the young man was that the speed of his alchemy circle was so fast. Counter alchemy was a 7-circle alchemy spell, 2 circles higher than storm mist. Blood refining? But that was not right. How could blood refining have such a high-level technique? Blood refining's magic circle was red, and his opponent's magic circle was bright white. The black-haired young man fell back in confusion. He coughed out a mouthful of blood and hurriedly covered it with his hands, but the bright red blood still gushed out from between his fingers. Counter-alchemy had almost instantly damaged his internal organs. Rono? The noble lady who was entangled by the thorns was shocked and cried out. The knight was also stunned. They did not expect that the black-haired young man, who had always been known as the strongest alchemist in the empire, would be severely injured by his opponent. Moreover, his opponent was also using alchemy and was also so young. The captain of the knight was shocked at first, but then he was furious. He could not imagine how furious His Majesty would be if he knew that such a genius was injured under his protection, and what kind of fate would befall him. Kill him. He shouted angrily, but the captain of the knight immediately realized that he was in the territory of the druids. He quickly changed his words and said, "Capture that Erewhon man." "Capture me?" Brando sneered. "What right do you have to capture me?" He looked around. There were more than 20 knights present, and every one of them was at least a middle silver. On one hand, this showed Cruz's strength. On the other hand, it also showed that the black-haired young man and the blonde lady with double ponytails were not simple people. However, there were only a little more than 20 middle-level silver knights. Brando heard their conversation just now and knew that they might have more powerful reinforcements, so he did not want to waste any more time on them. He took a step forward. With the young Lord of Erewhon as the epicenter, an unparalleled wave of energy exploded in all directions. Driven by the power of a level 16 military swordsmanship and the power of a gold-ranked knight, the White Raven sword's aura was so sharp that it was almost tangible. Although Brando did not draw his sword, the white aura was already as sharp as a blade. The centurion did not expect that this young man had not only stepped into the gold-ranked knight, but also reached the level of a master in swordsmanship. A quasi-sword saint. The knights screamed, but they were already swept away in a fan shape. There was no way they could resist the power of a knight who was 3 whole ranks higher than them. In just one breath, the 20 knights of the Cruz Empire were completely defeated. Brando was not surprised at all. If it was before he went to Schafland, it would have taken him a lot of effort to get rid of these people. But now they were no different from chickens and dogs. He raised his head and saw the noble lady cowering back weakly. Don't come over. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com. Chapter 374. Faina, what's going on here? Before Brendel could reply, a nobleman wearing a black ceremonial robe came out from the crowd of centaurs that were watching from afar. He looked at the young lady who was tied up, then at Rono and the other knight on the ground, and his expression changed. The middle-aged man raised his head and saw Brando standing in the middle of the field with Amandina and Scarlet behind him. His expression darkened, and he immediately pulled out his long sword and stabbed towards them. Brando felt a scorching aura along with the tip of his sword. Passive element, gold domain. Brendel and Scarlet's eyebrows twitched. The elements in their bodies reacted at the same time. After the space stagnated, everyone felt the temperature plummet. Arcs of electricity danced on the lightning spear in Scarlet's hand. The middle-aged man's sword was blocked by a fire shield when it was 3 inches away from Brando. His expression changed and he immediately retreated, cautiously looking at the 2 youths. "Who are you?" Cullens was shocked. He could tell that Brando and Scarlet were not Tanians, nor were they tree elves. Scarlet's striking red hair made it easy for him to tell that she was a Highlander. How come he had never heard of 2 gold domains at such a young age? Count Cullens, they're Erewhon's people. Faina patted her chest and sighed in relief when she saw the middle-aged man rushing over. They're the ones who injured Rono and the others. That young man, he even said that the Empire isn't worth mentioning. The Empire isn't worth mentioning? Cullens snorted when he heard those words. The glory of the Empire was the pride of every citizen of the Eagle Kingdom. In his eyes, Awin was just a small group of rebels. If it wasn't for the Wind Elves who were behind the scenes, Awin would have been wiped out long ago. Even if the Erewhon were recognized by the Holy Cathedral of Fire, the proud Cruz Empire was still unwilling to admit this. In their eyes, the Erewhon Empire was just a group of country bumpkins, and the nobles among them weren't nobles at all. The Erewhon Empire's King Eric was indeed from a noble family with a long history in the Cruz Empire. He looked at Brando with a dark gaze. "Young man, are you the one who said that?" Brando looked at the noble, and his impression of him ran in his mind. But there were too many nobles in the Cruz Empire, and the number of gold domains were as many as the stars in the sky. "I'm just telling the truth," he replied casually. "Well said." Cullens ground his teeth, but there was a cold smile on his pale face. "But I heard that your empire is in trouble right now. Oberg VII was defeated by Emir Madara, and he sent an envoy to beg the emperor for help. Oh, that old man should be dead by now, right?" He pretended to think for a moment and sighed. "There's civil strife, and it seems that your empire isn't doing well, young man. I don't know if the princess is interested in our 9th prince, or else our prince might be able to help. Even if the Cruz Empire isn't worth mentioning, it would be easy for them to solve the problem of the Erewhon Empire." The noble's words were filled with mockery, and it was jarring to the ears of any Awin citizen. It took Amandina a lot of effort to hold herself back from retorting. She was a girl after all, but she still gritted her teeth inwardly. Even Scarlet furrowed her brows. No matter how despicable Erewhon Empire was, it was still a country shared by everyone in this land. Being mocked by an outsider made her uncomfortable. As for Brando himself, the moment the man mentioned the princess, his face darkened. He placed his hand on the hilt of Haurangaya for the first time. He didn't draw his sword because he didn't want to kill anyone. But if someone wanted to die, he didn't mind helping them. A mere gold ranker. He could easily defeat Khodan with his swordsmanship and strength, but that wasn't his full strength. Don't forget that Brando was also a planeswalker and an elementalist. He didn't even need Scarlet to interfere. He was confident that he could make Khodan unable to utter a single syllable within 10 moves. Sifrid held Amandina's hand. She didn't have any feelings for the Erewhon Empire, but at least she knew that it was her brother's homeland. When she saw Brando's dark expression, she knew that he was unhappy. She raised her head and looked at the Count. "Who are you? You're not welcome here." Count Cullens was stunned. He didn't think that a child would dare to refute him. He was stunned for a moment, but he immediately sneered. How uncultured. As expected of a country bumpkin's child. But before he could finish his sentence, he couldn't continue. He wasn't the only one. Even the centaurs around him felt the air suddenly turn cold. The centaurs loved to watch a spectacle, and gladiator fights were a common occurrence for them. But at this moment, they saw a layer of frost forming on the wooden floor of the corridor at a speed visible to the naked eye. The cold frost caused the wooden floor to creak as if it was about to break. The frost was like a white snake that extended from Brando's feet to Cullens. "Is this an element? What a high-level ice element." The Count of Cruz's expression changed in an instant. He raised his sword to block Brendel's attack, but at that moment, a low voice came from outside the crowd. "Stop." Count Cullens was startled, but Brando didn't seem to hear it. He had already unsheathed Haurangaya, and the power of his element had reached its peak at this moment. It was as if the power of his element had reappeared in Grodin's hall. The white snake of frost shot towards Cullens like lightning, but this time it was destined to fail. An invisible force suddenly blocked Brando's momentum. It was like a transparent wall that suddenly cut off Brando's ability to sense his element. The young man raised his head in shock and saw the centaurs in front of him retreating to the sides. A woman wearing a red plush cloak and shining armor walked out from the back. Her long hair was as green as jade and draped over her shoulders like a waterfall. The woman was very beautiful. She was about 40 years old, but there were only a few wrinkles at the corner of her eyes. She only looked at Brando coldly. Brando was about to attack, but her glare froze him in place. Brando recognized this woman. She was Veronica, the commander of Cruz's Azure Firmament. She was one of the few female commanders in the Empire, and had participated in the November War. She was also the supreme commander of the Eastern Front in the Second Holy War. 30 years ago she already had the titles of Supreme Sword Saint, Dragon Knight, War Sage and Heavenly General. 100 years ago she had already awakened her elemental power. As for now, no one knew how strong she was. But if there were any top experts in the Cruz Empire, then this woman was definitely one of them. In fact, Brando couldn't help but feel goosebumps when he saw this woman. Although Veronica and Freya had a good relationship in the past, and could even be said to be half of the latter's teacher, in front of this powerful woman, the future Valkyrie was just a young girl. But no matter who she was, Brando didn't want to meet her in this place. Not to mention he had just taught her a lesson. Although it seemed like the Cruz Empire was the one who started it, who wouldn't protect their elders? Isn't this the same as asking for my life? Martha above, who wrote this script. Brando almost choked when he saw the woman's distinctive green eagle-shaped earrings. Do you look down on the Empire? The woman's first glance at the young man was cold, and her tone was not polite at all. Accompanied by such words, the woman's aura seemed to have turned into an unsheathed sword, and the tip of the sword was pointed directly at Brando. This made the young lord from Erewhon choke, but he stared into the woman's eyes, took a deep breath and replied. The ancestors of the Cruz Empire seemed to be used to solving problems with suppression and conquest, so they forgot the tolerance of civilization? Not only to his own people but to outsiders as well? Although Brando's heart was thumping, he didn't show any weakness verbally. This was the Druid's territory, at least here the other party wouldn't dare to do anything to him. His words were also aimed at the other party's sore spot. The Cruz Empire's cruelty and indifference had always been the reason why they were criticized by the Holy Cathedral of Fire. But fortunately, the Cruz Empire accounted for more than half of the 7 high priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, so they were still able to hold on to the religious power. Humph, I won't let you get away with it even if you have a sharp tongue, the female commander said coldly. Cullens, teach this Erewhon a lesson. Cullens turned around and sensed that Brando had been locked on by the legendary commander. He couldn't help but smile sinisterly. He couldn't kill in the Druid's territory, but he had no problem secretly making Brando's life difficult in the future. He was more than willing to destroy the future of 2 Erewhon's outstanding youths. He immediately bowed respectfully to Veronica, then drew his sword and stabbed Brando's wrist. But how could Scarlet, who was standing behind Brando, let him do as he wished? She raised her spear and blocked Cullens's path of attack, but just as she was about to strike, the female commander glanced at her coldly. At that moment, the red-haired girl was struck by lightning, and the halberd in her hand fell to the ground with a clang. You don't know what's good for you. Cullens sneered, the blade in his hand already close to Brando's body. P.S. What will Brando do when facing an elemental-level opponent? Next time, please listen to the breakdown. It's the end of the month. Where are the tickets? I'm begging for them. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 375. You're courting death. Cullens sneered. His sword was already close to Brando's body. Brando looked at him with the same pitiful gaze. The young lord was completely suppressed by Veronica's aura and couldn't move at all. But as he watched Cullens approach him step by step, the green light on his retina flashed layer by layer. Different attributes were quickly changing. Character. Mana pool. Attributes. Planeswalker skill tree. Card. At this moment, the attribute panel was fixed on the Planeswalker system. Then Brando smiled at Cullens. The latter was startled and didn't know why Brando was smiling. But Veronica, the commander of the Azure Firmament Legion, was the first to notice something was wrong. This little guy, Cullens, back off, she warned. But she was still a step too late. A white-gold flaming blade appeared in front of Brando, Sun Blade. This was the first time Brando used this card in a long time, and the unlucky Count Cullens became the first guest. He didn't expect Brando to be able to counterattack under Veronica's suppression, so when the blade of light condensed in front of him, the Count of Cruz could only stare in horror. He was hit head-on and flew back with a scream. He did a series of difficult 1800-degree turns in the air before falling heavily on the ground. Lord Cullens? The blonde girl with twin ponytails exclaimed. Veronica raised her beautiful green eyebrows. She didn't expect Brando to still be able to retaliate under her suppression. She was surprised and dissatisfied. Ever since she became the commander of the Empire's Legion, no one dared to be so arrogant in front of her. Veronica reached out to grab her sword, Azure Firmament. But after thinking about it, she held back. As the commander of the Empire's Legion and the extreme sword saint who was over 100 years old, bullying a junior was a disgrace to the Empire's dignity. But no matter what, the Empire's dignity couldn't be blasphemed. She raised her hand and coldly said, "Take this guy down." Veronica stared coldly at Brando. She waved her hand forward, and more than 30 knights from the Imperial Cavalry Division behind her swarmed forward. When Veronica spoke, she released the pressure on Brando. Even though the knights of the Imperial Army were nothing more than embroidered pillows, she believed that they were more than enough to deal with a small noble like Erewhon. She had seen Erewhon's army before. Other than the Royal Knight Regiment of Corvado who could barely be considered soldiers, the rest were just a bunch of rabble. But Brendel felt the pressure on his body loosen. He looked up and saw the Imperial Knights rushing towards him. At a glance, he recognized that the other party was the Kurlut's guards. Although these guys were not Kurlut's frontline legion, they were much more difficult to deal with than the Knights of the Border Cavalry Regiment he had just dealt with. After all, the Border Cavalry in Cruz was an organization similar to Erwin's Guards. Brando calmly took a step back and drew his sword for the first time. As soon as the sword was drawn, the cold light reflected from the dark blade made Vahina, who was tied up by thorns, cry out. That sword, be careful. It's the Crimson Blessing. But the black-haired youth's voice immediately covered her voice. Rono got up from the ground and wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. One of his hands was pressed on his chest, and it was extremely uncomfortable. But even the churning of his internal organs could not compare to the shock in his heart at this moment. He saw the silver gauntlet on Brando's right arm and finally confirmed his suspicion. It was the Crimson Blessing, the grip of Bahamut. A true divine weapon in the eyes of alchemists. Brando's hand was ignited with true red flames. The flames surged up his arm and swallowed Halran Gaia in an instant. Brando leveled his sword and charged towards the knight. At that moment he was like a demon from hell, leaving a trail of flames behind him. Veronica's face changed when she saw Brando's sword. This was not a quasi-sword saint at all. The youth standing in front of her was a true sword saint. And when she saw the sword and armor in his hand, she knew that she had made a huge mistake. She had underestimated her opponent. Veronica immediately grasped the hilt of Azure Firmament, but at this time, Brando was already like a burning phoenix, charging into the midst of the night. Attack from the front left. Orthlis's voice was cold and calm. She was fighting side by side with him. Take advantage of the gap between the knight's attacks. Don't let go of this opportunity to retreat. Pursue. It's best to block this attack first. Hey little guy, how did you do that? Orthlis was suddenly startled. She found that sometimes Brando seemed to know the enemy's intentions better than she did. She relied on her thousands of years of experience, but it was a stretch to say that Brando had talent. Even Orthlis was surprised that a person could have such talent in swordsmanship. Even Gretel doesn't have such talent, she thought. But at this moment Brando saw a different scene. Golden lines appeared in his eyes, outlining a complex image. Whether attacking, defending, or outflanking, the intentions of the knights were laid bare in these lines. As long as they lowered their bodies, a golden line would extend from their prepared attack path and pierce Brando's chest. This was the effect of in-depth analysis. Perhaps it was not perfect, but Brando found that this skill was surprisingly suitable for him. Especially with his hundreds of years of swordsmanship experience in the game, coupled with Orthlis's guidance, it was like adding wings to a tiger. Cruz's Knights Guards were sometimes blocked by Brando's sword before they could even make a move. The knights were so frustrated that they could die. They realized that something was wrong the moment they clashed with the young man. The young man seemed to know what they were trying to do. Sometimes they just instinctively lowered their shoulders to counterattack. Before they even realized how they were going to attack, the young man had already destroyed all their possible attacking routes with a single strike. It was a feeling that made them want to throw away their sword and run away like a mouse being teased by a cat. But Brando always stopped at the last moment, which surprised the knight. They knew that if he wanted to, he would have killed them long ago. But he didn't. Was he showing mercy? But it didn't seem like it. The knight didn't know why, but Veronica, who had unsheathed her sword, knew that Brando had long been paying attention to her. He knew from the beginning that she was going to make a move. But how did he know? She's about to make a move. Orthlis reminded. I'm curious. Brando looked at Veronica's direction while blocking the knight's attacks. Lady Orthlis in your prime, who was stronger between you and this lady? She's just a little girl, Orthlis snorted and replied with some confidence. I don't even need to use my sword to fight her. She's not even as strong as your grandfather. What? Brando was shocked. Careful, she's coming. The young lord raised his head and saw Veronica appear in front of him in an instant. He was shocked and rolled away to avoid his opponent's sword. Veronica was slightly startled, thinking that this guy dodged quite quickly. It seemed like he already knew how she was going to attack before she even appeared. But while she was surprised, Brando was being scolded. Why are you dodging? Orthlis was dissatisfied. Meet her head on. Lady Orthlis, I'm not afraid of her in terms of swordsmanship, but in terms of strength, I'm not even close to her. Brando explained as he dodged. Idiot, how can she use such a high level of strength here? Orthless scolded him in his mind, unless she wants to tear down this bazaar with her sword. Brando was stunned for a moment, then suddenly realized that this was the druid's aerial bazaar. Although there was a barrier protecting it, it could only support a battle between two gold-ranked fighters. No matter how high the power was, the barrier wouldn't be able to withstand it. He was stunned and almost got hit by the sword, but at the last moment he turned his head and dodged. Veronica's sword barely grazed his cheek. The sword's aura left a cut on his face. Brando felt a chill on his face, but Veronica was both angry and amused at the same time. This kid actually dared to be distracted during a battle with her. Even the famous sword St. Cruz was not so daring. And what surprised her the most was that he actually dodged. This kid. Veronica couldn't help but think, if only Cruz was more powerful, I would definitely let him follow me and inherit my legacy. But of course, Brando didn't know what the female commander was thinking. After Orthless's reminder, he decided to switch from defense to offense. He paused for a moment, then raised Earth to block the blade of the azure skies. Green and gray light intertwined, the azure skies was a wind fantasy weapon. In terms of level, it was not inferior to the Howran Gaia. However, the Earth was stable and naturally restrained the ever-changing wind element. Thus, Azure Firmament's whirlwind effect was almost completely suppressed. Brando only felt his arm go numb when the two swords collided. This woman is so strong, he thought to himself. But this time he didn't retreat. Instead, he pulled back his sword and stabbed at the opponent. Counterattack. Everyone was shocked. The Imperial Knight who couldn't even intervene could hardly believe their eyes. The young man was actually counterattacking. How dare you? Veronica was also angry. Not only was this kid not afraid of her, he even wanted to suppress her in a direct confrontation. This was simply a fantasy. P.S. There seems to be a restless aura in the air. What is it? I don't know. But that monthly ticket? Dragged away? To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.